out all the time.
Yeah. Well, we have, on the one hand, this is going to be laid back. We didn't read anything, but we did listen to a whole bunch of conversations. I guess
Mm.
three. I mean,
Or
okay, yeah, I threw another one in there. So there's the Levin and Deacon
yeah,
dialogue
yeah.
about evolutionary biology, and um, there's the Bernardo Kastrup and Jay Garfield dialogue about Madhyamaka Buddhism and analytic idealism, and some very ancient debates about metaphysics and um, this tendency to substantialize ideas or misplaced concreteness in Whitehead's terms. And we listened to my colleague Sean Kelly speak with. Do you remember the guy's name he was speaking with? I am actually blanking right now because I wasn't familiar with him. I'll have it in the a link to the podcast in any event. But
I
um,
want to. I wanted to say Jason Hoskins or something, but that might be someone completely different. That might be someone on Twitter.
yeah, I think that's someone else. Uh, and then
I,
what was the fourth one?
that you sent me that Rupert Sheldrake,
Oh,
Mark.
Rupert and Mark Vernon, of course.
I
Yeah,
think because Rupert had been not entirely complementarily referenced by Deacon.
right.
Deacon saying to Levin, "Oh, your old work reminded me more of Rupert Sheldrake, and that was a bad thing. But thankfully, you've grown out of that." Um,
Right. Yeah, yeah. So I definitely
yeah,
want to talk about that.
yeah,
And then so it was Luke Johnson who was in dialogue with
uh,
Sean Kelly
yeah.
about Hegel and Jung. Um,
Jason Hoskins, who is someone that I think we both
that
occasionally
one.
talk
Yeah,
to on
yeah,
Twitter.
that's right. So I think in addition to triangulating or um, whatever the four version of triangulate would be, uh,
Quadrangular.
quadrangulate all of those videos. You and I have been talking about what the metaphysical anti-ground or ground might be. Variation, in your terms, I think would be your preference for how to do
Yeah.
that. And Whitehead has creativity, but then there's also this co-eternal thing, God in its primordial and consequent poles, phases. And I think that that's very much at the core of a lot of the uh, ideas thrown around in these discussions. And so, I don't know where we want to start. I mean, actually, I do know where we want to start. I'll get to that in a second, but I just wanted to make sure you knew that I came fully armed with
Oh, good.
process morality. And
I always assume, Matt, that you have all the quotes memorized. What do you even need
well,
to for at this point?
I just like to rehearse some of these pages.
I have I've come armed with some simple.
Okay.
We can battle. Um,
Um, but I think, one thing I'll throw into the mix, which I know you already have a response to, which is when it comes to variation, I have trouble knowing what it means without its polar complement,
yeah,
something invariant.
yeah,
Um, and so I feel like to reference variation is already to implicitly, in a sense, depend on something invariant by which you would even know that there was variation occurring. Which I kind of think is what's going on with the primordial nature of God and creativity in Whitehead, that sort of conceptual oscillation at the groundless ground of everything, where you know, there are problems if you only have the primordial nature as the base concept.
yeah.
And you might want to get along with just creativity, but can you even reference creativity without implicitly having some invariance in the background? So let's return to that. But the first thing I want to say is more coming out of the Jay Garfield
Hmm.
Kastrup conversation, just about the 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 purpose of metaphysics, or what I think the aim of
Hmm.
philosophizing, let's just say, should be. And I feel like Buddhism allows us to avoid spiraling off the proper aim of philosophizing into, I don't know, the abstraction Olympics or something, and instead just keep the eye on the on the prize, which is it attending to human existence and to um, the suffering that comes from being embodied and coexisting with other bodies. Uh, Dukkha literally means crowded space, and so I think making sure our metaphysics is soteriological, that it's actually going to help us suffer less, I think is really important. And I was glad to see at various points um, Jay Garfield, who I guess you hung out with in the past. I was glad to see him direct the conversation in that way and remind everyone of that. But I also felt like in the exchange with Bernardo Kastrup, who also has a way of um, a form of fixity in an alignment with a perceived truth that prevents meeting difference in a productive way,
Mm,
dialoguing versus debating. And I
mm.
think they both kind of fell into a debate mode, even though I think Jay and Bernardo too would probably both say they prefer not to debate because it does take you off this proper aim of metaphysics, which is to alleviate suffering. And so in any exchange of ideas with somebody, I feel like if you end with a very sharp disagreement, it's like a missed opportunity to alleviate suffering.
Perhaps. I suppose that just really depends on one's definition of debate as well, and where we
Mhm.
draw the line between debate and dialogue. And debate perhaps can be. I mean, there's an ideal of debate which I think is both instantiated in probably scientific contexts. I mean, the ideal is present in those contexts. Is it actually manifested and instantiated in those contexts? Well, often not. Uh,
Mhm.
and I've been part of big public debates in the scientific context, which really did not um, instantiate this sort of ideal of a kind of constructive debate where we're all learning from each other and we're not, confusing our, positive theses with our own egos and all of that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
Um, and then but there is that ideal there, and then I think there's that also that ideal in this Indian context, which Jay was talking about, this sort of classical Indian context where people are, vociferously debating, but with a view to soteriology, that getting our ideas right, and the only way to do that is in a kind of more or less debate-like exchange. Getting our ideas right does have this potentially transformative if and soteriological salvific um, ataraxia, maybe we're trying to achieve in the Greek sense.
Yeah.
Effect. And what
Right.
Jay did say in another dialogue with that same on that same channel, which I just listened to about the first 15 minutes or so of this morning.
Likewise. I also listened.
Okay, well, so then I think the first question, perhaps even that the host asked him was, "What is the purpose of philosophy?" And Jay did touch on that a couple of times in the discussion with Bernardo, and probably most clearly in response to an audience question at the end of that dialogue. But this was the first question he was asked in this other video, which is like the title, slightly clickbaity title, but is very much a Jay thing to say. It's like the idea of reduction is absolutely crazy or something like that. Um, but
Absolutely. Yeah.
yeah, well, I don't know if it said absolutely actually, but yeah, the host, I think his name is Amir, asked Jay, "What is the purpose of philosophy for you?" And Jay explicitly said, "It's transformation." Uh,
Mhm.
so exactly to your point, there is this sort of soteriological aim there. But I think that Jay is very committed to the idea that debate can take us there.
Mhm.
And I think he also, because he has this, he's very he has a certain way of what I call a performative dogmatism in debate. Um, and he's very, very, sharp and very tries to be very precise and kind of refuses to, we were talking about this on WhatsApp, but he refuses to engage in that kind of, mutual, reciprocal, translational dance where you say something that I don't really agree with in the way you phrased it, but I translate it into my own terms and I say, so what you're saying is kind of actually this. And then you say, well, not exactly, but and then we somehow sort of meet in the middle by merging our frameworks. And Jay is he's anti that move, I would say. And I've often heard him say things like, well, I don't want to make the mistake of thinking everybody's saying the same thing. So I think
Yeah.
he's very committed to maintaining a very, kind of a hardline position in order to
Yeah.
differentiate it from other views.
I
And
mean,
then,
in a sense, that like analytic mode of thinking is necessarily oppositional,
yeah, yeah,
you know, in this translational mode. I love that way of thinking of that mode of thinking, translational thinking that's not prone to debate. It's more synthetic,
yeah.
it's seeking integration rather than uh, engaging in thought as an exercise in analysis to separate the wheat from the chaff and say this is the right view and that's the wrong view.
And I think that there's a place for both of these things.
Mm.
And I do find it challenging, or I did find it challenging in the past with Jay Garfield, that I do think he's one of the most lucid exponents I've ever come across of a conventionalist philosophy,
Mhm.
which is, not grounded on some absolute foundation. It kind of its conventions all the way down, and you know very well that I'm very much in that sort of camp in the way that I think.
I
Uh,
also consider myself an anti-foundationalist. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So, and to be clear, obviously, this is not relativism, and there's a lot of beautiful writing again from Jay and people in that milieu about why Madhyamaka skepticism, for example, is not relativism,
Mm.
um, et cetera, et cetera. But given that he's such a lucid exponent of conventionalism, I sometimes find that, again, in this sort of performative dogmatism, it reminds me a little bit of ways people talk about Karl Popper, although I do think, Jay is a genuinely lovely human, and I'm not sure the same could have been said about Karl Popper. Um, but then again, I don't know him, I didn't know him.
Suffered some
Uh,
trauma, I think, in his life.
yeah. Um, Jay does sometimes act in those debates as though he is in possession of the perfect dictionary, right? As though this is the way of saying things. And so
Mm.
I think he strays into this territory, which I call refutation by reification, and the self is a really obvious example in the kind of hardline Buddhist context, where it's like
Mm.
the self is X, so I will define the self as something. Nothing that is X could possibly exist according to, say, the Buddhist marks of existence. Thus, there is no self. And
Yeah.
it's not open to the argument of, well, actually, I use the word self a little bit differently from that, and maybe, um, so it's a kind of, this is what the thing is, because it can't be that, or something like that can't exist. It's refuted, and then there's a refusal to budge on that definitional move, which
Mhm.
is the whole argument in a sense.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I know Jay Garfield's really into Wittgenstein, and
Mm,
um, part of his conventionalism is grounded in that, not only this Buddhist resistance to reification and the idea of dependent coordination, but he applies it in language, uh, his understanding of language as well. And that conventionalism at the level of language, though, seems to, I mean, you'd think he'd be more flexible about how words are used because, um, why does language need to be wielded as a weapon, which is what happens in debate, where you get attached to certain words and ways of phrasing things and are unwilling to go a layer deeper. And I think recognize that I know I agree with Wittgenstein, like there's no private language, but I also don't think concepts and words are simply the same thing. There is a conceptual process which precedes linguistic articulation. Um, and I don't know that, I'm not saying all Wittgensteinians deny that, or that's just what a private language would mean, but I think that sometimes gets lost in
mm,
a um, purely conventionalist understanding of language that then's translated into, you know, uh, this idea that there is no pre-English or whatever the vernacular is, conceptual process going on. But yeah, I mean, language as a weapon leads you into a debate, and I think the alternative way of engaging in rhetorical exchange or transaction with someone would be to consider language more like a intrinsically artistic medium and a commons that, the best we could hope to do is uh, come up with metaphors that are appealing. And even in logic, we're ultimately using very well formalized metaphors, maybe, but we're still using metaphors. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah, I think perhaps there's a tendency, again, I don't want to, speak for Jay at all, but in that mode of using language as a weapon, but whilst in service of, in fact, a contemplative soteriological perspective,
mhm,
there's a tendency to actually bracket those two things in a very, very strong sense. And I do think there are important reasons to do that, actually, as you know.
mhm.
But language then becomes, well, the actual function of the language here is the use as an analytic weapon. And of course, because the ultimate nature of things is empty, and we can think about parallels with ineffability and um,
Which of course is just a metaphor. Emptiness itself is a metaphor, right? So
sure,
it's
sure, sure, sure. But it's something that is beyond articulation, beyond thought, all of that. So we're not really even talking about that. We're just saying that we can't talk about that. And
Mhm.
then when we are then engaged in debate, we're using language as a weapon. And I think this is also, so one of the things that gets talked about in that discussion, very briefly, is the difference between these two Madhyamaka schools, Prasangika and Svatantrika. And my understanding of that, and it's some years since I was paying really close attention to these things, but I was quite into it for a while, is that the Prasangika school is and Jay does say this, they wield the reductio argument as a weapon, and their entire debate strategy is to deconstruct the opponent's position without, in fact, providing a positive alternative of their own. And then Svatantrika, they are, and as Jay was discussing, there are debates about whether there's a real difference between these two schools, and people are people are identifying as Prasangikas but being called Svatantrikas by other, like whatever. It's all but in Svatantrika, there you can present a positive position, I think. And so, in some sense, that's more like a kind of Popperian fallibilism, in which you are, on the one hand, a hardcore skeptic. So when you present a positive position, you're still committed to the four, not just three, but the four marks of existence, emptiness, not self, interdependence, and impermanence. And emptiness being the big one for the Madhyamikas. So your own positive thesis is empty, but you are erecting it as a tool in the debate, whereas Prasangikas limit themselves supposedly to the reductio argument. So
Yeah.
um,
Yeah. I think I feel like maybe we've both been mostly critical of Garfield first here, but probably both of us agree way more with him than with Bernardo about most questions.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, I do think it's a real demonstration of the virtue of that Prasangika reductio approach, actually. Just despite, where we might differ from Jay, and indeed with the mode of delivery and how vociferous the debate became, I do think it was a great example of how something that you might be tempted to just accept via one of these moves of translation. You might be like, oh, well, that's pretty much okay. Well, okay, Bernardo's an analytic idealist and whatever, but he's kind of talking about something really similar to what Whitehead is saying, or what, a process relationalist more broadly would accept. So it's okay. We agree, and because of Jay's refusal to agree, you actually get to see, I think, I mean, that this is sort of how I already felt about Bernardo, not that I have deep familiarity with his position, but you get to see how foundationalist, how essentialist, um,
Reductionist.
how reductionist,
Yeah.
exactly that position.
Proudly. I mean,
Proudly,
that's just
proudly.
what it means to be analytical and scientific for him.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But it revealed him as very, very, I mean, regardless of the merits of the content, it revealed him as very, very dogmatic, really, very, very rigidly adhering to his particular view. And after Jay left, he even basically said, if people don't agree with me about, several things, um,
Non-contradiction as a
contradiction
logical assumption.
being
Yeah.
one of the
Very
examples.
consistent logic is not allowed
Yeah, yeah,
in
exactly.
analytic idealism. Uh,
Um, yeah, he said, what did he say? If they don't endorse the principle of non-contradiction, and he still insists that from that everything follows. So even though Jay, spoke about that specifically, Bernardo kind of insisted that, well, if you allow contradiction, then anything goes. And Jay's like, no, 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 there are, that's not the case in paraconsistent logics, and that's not the case in a kind of conventionalist view in general, right? And if they don't agree that all infinite regress is vicious, so Jay was saying, you've got to demonstrate that an infinite regress is vicious. There's no reason why regress is inherently vicious. And thus that there must be something absolute, right? So if you agree that infinite regress is vicious, then you agree there must be a ground. You agree the buck must stop somewhere. There must be something absolute. That's a quote, I think, from Bernardo, and that the one pre-theoretical given in nature is subjectivity, i.e., that absolute is in fact subjectivity, then he can't have a debate with them. And really, if you take all of those positions together, it's like if you're not an analytic idealist.
mhm.
I mean, if you don't agree that if you're not a foundationalist and you don't agree that basically the only pre-theoretical given in nature is subjectivity, then I can't debate with you.
Yeah.
Well, then you
Yeah.
can't debate at all because you don't brook any disagreement.
Yeah. I mean, I won't take the time to find the exact quote, but in the beginning of Process and Reality, Whitehead talks about how trivial it is for two different metaphysical schemes to produce descriptions of the facts that don't course that contradict one another, and that's like very uninteresting. And it's inevitable in metaphysics that you're going to construct these schemes that you hope are internally consistent. But when you're engaging deliberately to meet a different scheme to try to see triangulate your approach to the truth, if you're not going to work on translation between the two, then you're not
Mm,
even going to be communicating with each other. And so what's the point? There's no, I mean, I guess the point of a debate like what Bernardo and Jay did was for the audience's sake. And I think I certainly felt like issues were clarified in my mind, even if uh, Bernardo and Jay didn't come into any agreement about, I mean, they didn't agree about anything.
no.
Um, but I think I felt I felt more, I mean, it was frustrating to watch at some points, but I left with more coherence than I started with in
Yeah.
terms of how I understand Bernardo's position and what the stakes are here. And, I think one of the things I really appreciated, though, about what um, Jay did was put ideas in historical context.
Yeah.
Ideas have histories, and I think that's his conventionalism,
Yeah.
whereas Bernardo, referring to his idealism as analytic, I think like analytic philosophy generally, though, I mean, I guess Jay is an exception, um, doesn't really like to think about the history of the ideas. It's just, come up, what's the argument? And the argument could have been made by Plato 2,500 years ago or 2,300 years ago, or it could have been made today. And it's the logical content of that argument is the same. Um, Whereas I think if you put ideas in historical context, again, you're less likely to miss, first of all, the soteriological uh, function of philosophy, because that's even it's not just Buddhism, it's, the whole Socratic lineage, I think emphasizes, and the Neoplatonic lineage emphasizes the way that philosophy is like preparation for dying. We're building
Mm,
the death ship where this is a spiritual exercise and not just
mm,
arguments for the sake of an
mm.
abstract truth. Um, but I think that grounding of ideas, if that's probably not the right word, but that locating of ideas in history is really important. And it's one of the things that I always was uncomfortable with in Bernardo's thought, because there's such a rich history of idealisms
Yeah.
that one could draw on. And I know he taps into Schopenhauer, he taps into Jung. Not that Jung's just an idealist, um, but other than that, I feel like uh, there are forms of idealism that come out of Schelling and Hegel's thought, and even Fichte's thought, or the British idealists later, like F.H. Bradley. I mean, that are so much more. I mean, I don't find anything. Sorry, Bernardo, but there's just not much original that's not already in these other thinkers, and all of those arguments have been responded to. And so,
Yeah.
Jay was a little impatient at certain points because he's an academic philosopher, and Bernardo has a PhD, but you specialize when you get a PhD, and you're not necessarily involved in the wider conversation. And so there's always so much more history to know, but I feel like trying to establish one's ideas outside of and independent of that conversation that's been going on for a long time is a little bit irresponsible, maybe. Um, and it doesn't mean that you can't come up with good ideas that are popular and that help, people massage out some metaphysical knots. But I feel like it risks leaving you blind to um, the already extant, knockdown arguments against what you think is indubitable.
Yeah, no, it's such a difficult balance to strike, the balance between a kind of deference to history and the desire and really need, because it's a motivating impulse, it's a drive to do something, original, to feel like you own your ideas in some sense. And of course, if you spend, you know, I don't know if too much is the right word, but if you spend a lot of time studying the history of philosophy, it's going to you're going to come away with the impression that your ideas are not very original, uh,
It's
which
painful.
they probably, and it is painful. And I think it's also healthy to keep confronting that, but at the same time, it can be a way that you lose motivation.
Hmm.
Um, and so I don't know what the balance to strike there is. I mean, I think in the kind of YouTube era, there are obviously a lot of people who have, you know, developed quite an audience by um, uh, articulating something that is original or seems original or iconoclastic or whatever in this particular context. But then if you were to put that into again this rich history of thought, and obviously not just Western thought, as this debate particularly demonstrates in terms of the similarity of things going on in Indian thought for at least a couple of millennia, um,
Hmm.
then there's something else of great interest there, right? There's something of very historical interest there, but it does, and we've talked about this with other things. It's like, oh, is it how original is assembly theory, or is it really just another way of just talking about a kind of generic constructivist evolutionary thought? And one can do this a lot, and which is undermine the originality of a given thought by historically contextualizing it. But then at the same time, you might be missing something that is kind of original, and the way that even, as I think we would also agree, because the role of context is so, pervasive in sense, it's like the only context-free truth is that context is, you know, inescapable. So we're relational thinkers, right? So by inserting an old idea or by making the past present, present again, we do renew it in a certain way, and there is a certain originality to it, and maybe for something like assembly theory, borrowing from or kind of mashing up formalisms that might be used in one context and bringing them into another or whatever. There's a kind of inter or transdisciplinarity to the approach, which is original, even if the ultimately the thought form that seems to undergird the whole thing is not that original.
Isn't
So
it isn't it odd that like the word invention literally means to find and the word fact literally means to make? It's like these words get
uh,
reversed at some point.
yeah, it's very peculiar.
I think that just speaks to the paradox of creation and discovery being so entangled.
Yeah, and I think that this is, I mean, to your point, and we've talked about this previously, but I think that duality or binary between invention and discovery is a false binary anyway, especially when we talk about mathematics in this way. Is mathematics invented or discovered? It's like, no, it's a false dichotomy, really. For in my case, for evolutionary kind of, constructivist, like constructive realist
Yeah.
views. But just one thing that you said a couple of comments ago, which, just to bring back the context thing, I do think there's something about you were talking about the artistic
Mm.
deployment of language. There is a kind of intrinsic polysemy to words, right? They mean different things. And it's funny to say intrinsic polysemy because this is again an example of just the transcendent role of context, So inserting a word into a particular context is what gives it its meaning. I think this will be a good way for us to segue probably into some of the Deacon Levin stuff as well,
Mm.
because of like Terence's discussion of what information is, for example, in that discussion, which opens on to some very rich um, areas of thought, I think. But yeah, I think there's a role. So there's a role for the analytic precision, and then there's a role for the kind of virtuous vagueness of language. And we never kind of get it right in any given context because there's no there's no precision or there's no absolute um, criterion which can tell you right now is the time to be hyper analytic and now is the time to go into poetic mode and allow that vagueness to flourish or whatever, but both
Yeah.
things have their virtues, and I think a lot of
Upaya, right?
yeah, exactly. Upaya, so skillful means, right? And a lot of debates that we have, and especially in the contemporary context, or in the modern context, like science versus religion kind of debates and things like that, or reductionist debates. This is more true because it's more exact. For example, like Deleuze would talk a lot about this, right? Conflation of the true and the exact. And that's a big issue, and it does lead to people talking past each other a lot. And so I have a principle of like bidirectional coarse graining, which I sometimes talk about here, which is like when you make something incredibly precise, like in a limit sense with a deterministic model, like a mathematical model or perhaps a computational model, you are in fact screening out or filtering out a lot of very real details about other, aspects of reality which cannot be figured in such a precise way, which are again intrinsically vague. And that vagueness is itself a virtue, and holding this balance between these two different approaches
Yeah.
is yeah.
It reminds me of we've talked about scale a lot and continuity and discontinuity or discreteness. Um, and this metaphor that comes up several times in the debate between Bernardo and Jay. And then Jay talked about it again in his follow-up video, uh, between the ocean and the waves.
um,
And, Bernardo loves to talk about this mind at large or this universal subjectivity as equivalent to the water and our embodied sense of having a particular perspective on the world as separate subjects is, he calls it a dissociative alter, but those are the waves on the surface of the water.
yeah.
And Jay pointed out that we don't want to substantialize the water, obviously, but I was thinking about how when we think of water in this metaphor, as Bernardo wants us to think of it, it's like a phenomenological relationship to water. It seems when it's calm to be just this crystal clear, placid,
Mhm.
um, neutral sort of substance. But we know when we look closer, it's actually a violent like agitation of molecules.
Yeah.
And those molecules are themselves, made of atomic elements that are themselves composed of violently agitated subatomic events of various kinds. And so
Mhm.
there's not actually a point where the variation, the waving stops, right?
Yeah.
Um, but and yet there do seem to be these discrete levels of um, a kind of resolution where an individual appears, you know.
Yeah.
And
Co-
so,
con- Concrete abstraction. Uh,
mm,
maybe we'll
right,
get to that as we get into Levin and
yeah.
Deacon as well. Just
But a
to
concrete abstraction that's not just a projection of our human way of categorizing things.
concrete. It's
Yeah,
concrete. That's what I mean by that. It's a real abstraction, right?
it's a real
It's
abstraction. Yeah. Abstraction is nature's mode of realization, right? And not just,
how
yeah.
construction works. That's how emergence works, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, and so I think what I think there's something about Bernardo's perspective that I do want to salvage here, which is not the idea that there's a fundamental reduction layer that everything else is an instance of or a property of. Um, but there is it there is sense to be made of invariance. That's not simply some kind of dogmatic imposition of a, sky daddy. You know, I think there's reason to think that invariance is just as real as variation.
great.
And that invariance is not simply an emergent habit or enduring, um, yeah, convention that comes from variation and the evolutionary process of selection and inheritance. I think invariance can have, does have, um, a role even when we're thinking about firstness, um, in Peirce's sense of firstness. So there's something eternal in the firstness in the way that Peirce understands it. I think that yes, it's like chance. It's like it has this immediate sort of unpredictability about it, but it's also there's something invariant there too. Um,
Well, it's very unpredictability or its variation is
yeah,
invariant. Yeah.
yeah. The only constant is change, we like to say, which you can't even say what you mean without implying the opposite.
And
Uh,
this is because, I mean, this is where contradiction
mhm.
is
Yeah.
important, to affirm that contradiction can exist, and where we can say that it is always going to be a kind of, I don't know if category error is really the right term, but in the loose sense, category error to say that what is ultimate is, A or B, is consciousness or matter,
Mhm.
is, change or stability is many or one,
Yeah.
and so we do look for some of the, when we're being vague and felicitously vague, necessarily vague in speaking about kind of origin concepts, then we can say, like you and I have talked about, the many one, and it really depends in so many ways on what you're trying to do with the thought, like Peirce will say, if we are to explain the universe, right? So if you're trying to erect an explanatory hypothesis, you better not start with preconceived or pre-structured, pre-formed elements that have like determinate form, because you
Mhm.
just took them off the table. You erected an unexplained explainer, and you're
Yeah.
going to explain things in terms of something that you can't explain. So that's why Peirce is clear that, when you're thinking about firstness in a cosmogenic sense, you're thinking about this kind of germinal nothing, in which the
Mhm.
only constant is change. But it's not determinately nothing. It's pure indeterminacy, right? It can't have any determinate content. And this is just a principle of impoverishment as well, because like determinate content is explanatory baggage. If you're using that to explain things and saying it itself is not amenable to explanation, well, you just put a block in the path of inquiry, Peirce would say. So when you're
Yeah.
trying to do explanatory reasoning, like you you want to minimize the preformed content. But again, depending on your role, on the desideratum, if you're trying to explain some very local, concrete system that is obviously in medias res, like is itself formed from a deep history of inherited, it's informed by a deep history of inherited form and all of that, then of course you're going to take. So when you're using the variation in an evolutionary context to speak about some clade and its traits and trying to understand them. There is a way that methodologically you take variation first. Like you don't posit that a trait came into the world for a particular purpose, right? Because again, that's just non-explanatory. That's special creation. You're saying, okay, I can't explain this, so it's just here because look, the thing needs to see. That's why it has an eye. You can't do that. That's not explanatory. But of course, when you take variation as a substrate for these things, you are also taking the invariant context in which it comes to be. So you can say that, there is an organismal phenotype and it kind of is doing things and needs to do things. And then there's this layer of variation, whether it's genetic mutations, stochastic gene expression, spontaneous brain activity, all of these different things, which are concrete, quote unquote, substrates for undirected variation. But they are, of course, always in relation to an invariant, um, you know, which in relation to which they are variations of, undirected
Yeah.
variations of, right?
So
So,
the nature of light for organisms which have evolved the capacity for sight, the nature of light is an invariant. And there's something, I wouldn't want to say that that there was some premonition of eyesight that, generated an eyeball in the course of evolutionary history. And yet there's something about light which does imply sight. And there's something in light for organisms to um, become and enter into a tropic relationship with. There's
yeah, and that's the principle of selection in many ways. I mean, really, when you're talking about it in that way, and to be Persian about it, you're talking about the interplay of firstness, secondness, and thirdness always already,
Mhm.
because firstness is that undirected variation, and you affirm the existence of that, and that something had to be built from that, so that you don't just affirm the like premonition, like I need an eye, so here's an eye, which would be magic.
Mhm.
But you're saying that there is a pre-existent, phenomenon, which is almost the wrong word to use, but
Mhm.
but there's a pre-existent property in, which is light, um,
Mhm.
and also that the when you are constructing this evolutionary lineage, when you talk about the purpose, you're evolving light sensitive cells, and ultimately eyes and things, so that you can make use of that relation, that available relation between light and a light sensitive cell, in order to orient yourself in the world. Well, in order to, for the purpose of, so as to, all of those are claims about thirdness, right? So you're saying that,
Yeah. But already in the light itself, in radiation, I think what I would want to say is there's not the specific purpose of creating an eyeball of a water-based eye or an insect eye or any kind of specific physiology, but there's an there's I don't know. I would want to artistically suggest that there's something in light that is seeking sight. There's something about light that leads it to sight, and that it's not a specific idea um, or a kind of teleology in the way that we would think of how an architect designs a building, but it is a um, light already has a directionality to it, and it has a kind of aim and a kind of these least action principles, I think, are suggestive of um, an intuition of, I guess, of the presence of the future and the presence of the future. Yeah, that allows there to be a minimal form of action, a quantum of action, if you will, that it introduces uh, a sense of the possible already at the level of light, and a sense of the possible is minimal mind, you know. Um, and so that's like this is again, I'm speaking metaphorically about a physical process, right? The radiation of um, electromagnetic energy, but also trying to connect as in a scientific way, physics and biology. So
Mm.
in a way that doesn't mm, make biology seem fundamentally different from what was going on in the physical world, and that also doesn't make biology seem like just and psychology and like this intensification of this capacity for purpose and aim that doesn't make it seem um, totally accidental, but that it was somehow already implicit, in the photon.
Yeah, I mean, I think principles of least action and biology do obviously connect in the sense that the relational principle, the principle of least action is a relational principle.
Mhm.
A kind of negotiation, if you want, between a system and its environment. So, the path of least action is always contextually defined, locally contextually defined. Um, so that systems of various kinds follow paths of least action, or that more formally speaking and instrumentally speaking, their behavior can be understood using variational principles, um, is a function of obviously a distinction between system and environment, and um, an assertion, but an empirically valid assertion that uh, a system will take a path through its environment that is in some sense dictated by its environment, but is, the path of least action, given the material or whatever other constraints are relevant here. Um, so yeah, I mean, I think that it's an ecological principle. Essentially, it's a relational principle. So it's another principle about the kind of transcendent role of context.
Mhm.
Um, I don't know, whether I think that, the
I
future.
mean, I'm not saying that eyes were inevitable just because there was
No, 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 I know,
light,
yeah, yeah,
but I think I'm trying to avoid I'm trying to avoid having to make life and mind into something that doesn't fit. And I mean, we're here, so it clearly fits in this physical universe, but doesn't fit in a conceptual sense that like we need a whole different set of categories to understand what the living world is and what mind is.
yeah,
Um, and I think it matters again, soteriologically, how we understand our own consciousness and our capacity to suffer as a component in the cosmos, as some aspect of the whole universe, whether we think of it as like this accident that's not somehow implied by just the very existence of a physical universe, um, versus imagining life and mind and our own consciousness as like the flower of that cosmic process. Um, I think that does shift how we relate to our own suffering, our own death, um, and what the larger project is that we're involved in.
yeah,
Because if life is something highly, I mean, it is precarious. Like a human life, any life form is precious, and we don't want to just. This is Hans Jonas's worry, right, with Whitehead, that he's eliminating the severity, existential severity of death. So death is real, but I feel like if we can put death in the context of this for me is this is animism in my point of view, to think of light as wanting to uh, light as having this aim at um, what becomes sight. It's not that it knows in advance that it was going to create eyes, but light already implies sight, as I'm trying to render it
well,
poetically.
yeah. I mean, I think it's animism because for me, animism is precisely this relational principle
Mhm.
that, these things things that encounter one another are, reciprocally informed. So it's that's necessity of, or basic fact of, again, an ecological mode in which a thing is the kind of thing that it is, and this is a behavioral principle as well. So a photon is taking the path that it's taking because of its encounter with a particular medium that it's moving through, or something like that, at that level. But an organism is, you know has the form that it has the capacities that it has, because of, obviously, not just the synchronic context of its ecology, but those synchronic contexts and the way they've been inherited diachronically.
Evolutionary history. But what if photon, I mean, you talk, and what if, I mean, this is Whitehead's wager, right? Metaphysically, is to think in terms of the whole universe as an ecology of organisms. And so any persisting entity, whether
Yeah.
it's a photon or a planet or a cell or an animal, is an organism.
Yeah, and of course, I am a thoroughly relational thinker, in the sense that, for me, there is no determinacy. There's no definite. This is actually a beef that I have with Whitehead. There is no definiteness outside of an actual situation. And even the
Mm.
definiteness or the quasi-definiteness of possibilities are themselves receive that definiteness because of their adjacency with an actual situation.
Which could be his position. I'm not convinced that he's, when he talks about general possibility or potentiality versus real potentiality, because real potentiality is what you're talking about. But when he talks about general potentiality, I think he would agree or admit that we can't actually say anything about that.
Well, it's in the same, in the Persian sense, that real or pure, because he likes his
Yeah.
purity, right? Pure potential is absolutely indeterminate. So it's a limit concept, right?
Mhm.
That it's the pure indeterminacy that is disconnected from any actual situation. So, I mean, obviously we can't say anything about it because we're in an actual situation, and it has no relation to us,
Yeah.
because it
So
is.
it's a regulative ideal in the Kantian sense.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, and that regulative ideal is pure indeterminacy.
Yeah.
Like, pure potential is pure indeterminacy.
Yeah.
Um, but so, I mean, there are too many things going through. I mean, one of
Sorry.
the no, 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 it's fine. It's great.
I went
Um,
on my Goethean tangent about light, so I don't know where that came
no,
from.
no, no, it's very generative. And it's good to put me in a position where, I don't necessarily have preformed responses myself, except to say that, of course, I'm on board with everything being relational. And this is indeed how I understand animism, that it's, if we were going back to the Buddhist context, it's the principle of, dependent co-arising or interdependence, right? Like, there is no arising, there is no
Mm.
actualization without a kind of reciprocal informing um, that goes on between, stipulated system, stipulated environment. When we make that distinction, we see that, in fact, even when we've made the distinction, the two things are, like, completely, interpenetrating one another. And that's what a principle of least action also indicates to us. I mean, does it indicate anticipation? Well, I don't think it necessarily does for, like, a photon, because a photon will just change its behavior when it encounters a different medium, and it's obviously moving as fast as anything can move. So is it anticipate? Does it need to anticipate that? It just has an instantaneous change in its behavior, basically, or as instantaneous as it can be from our reference frame, right? That's instantaneous to us.
Yeah.
One of the things I wanted to come back to, though, if I can, if I have the working memory to do it, is, I guess,
Just to say though, I feel like, light seems to me to be a limit percept
no,
for
yeah,
us in the way that um, Whitehead's, general or pure potentiality is a limit concept. Um, just to
yeah.
throw that
Yeah,
into the mix.
that's a nice way of putting it. So I
Mhm.
wanted to just go back to history for a second, and the history of ideas, and the one of the
I
reasons.
hope I didn't come across as like a pedantic ass
No,
earlier when I was critiquing Bernardo, but anyways, I felt
oh,
bad about
no,
that.
no, I don't think
Dropping
so at all.
names and talking about the history of philosophy and
No, 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 no. I think it's I mean, if anyone came across as pedantic, obviously it was very much Jay. And I think that where he was not at his best, for me in that debate was when he was being, a bit condescending, like, this is elementary sort of
Right.
thing. I mean, even though I can appreciate his
We
frustration.
philosophers now know
Yeah,
his version.
exactly. Yeah, I mean, I know where that comes from, but at the same time, I don't think it's helpful. Um, but one of the reasons to be studying history, and I know you will agree with this, the history of ideas and the history of the ideas that exercise us in the present, is also to identify a history of false problems, right? So some of the problems that are bequeathed to us by history of philosophy or cultural evolution or whatever, it's not that we shouldn't feel that we ought to refute them, because they are still present in some, current of contemporary thought. Reductionism is alive and well, the mechanical philosophy is alive and well, all of that, right? So we do need to critique them. But I think, part of our critique is just demonstrating that these are in fact false problems. So, I always say that the mechanical philosophy has a hard problem of consciousness. I don't. And I of course fully agree that life is not alien, mind is not alien, but there are different approaches we can take to that, nonetheless, because it'd be quite different. I think the kind of panpsychist approach here of saying that, well, mind has to be fundamental in some sense and pervasive, like ubiquitous, pan. Um, Otherwise, we could never explain its emergence from matter. Well, you're already in the Cartesian framework there because you've accepted the duality and you've accepted that there is some schism between them, and thus the one thing could never emerge from the other. Whereas if you've got a different ontology, you don't have to accept that there is that kind of schism. Mind
Yeah.
doesn't mind doesn't look miraculous from a process relational point of view, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's pan, that it's pervasive either. It just is an intensification. And Whitehead will say this about consciousness specifically, right? It's an intensification. So there's no like of more generic patterns or more generic process. So there's no real problem with emergence of that kind. And it's kind of it's just that's an illusion in a sense. We have this perspectival difficulty with the fact that I seem to have subjectivity and my books don't, or whatever.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, I accept the hard problem of consciousness really just as a framing, only as a bridge, because I think, when Chalmers sets that up, he's trying to speak to the common sense among scientists, at the very least, because the mechanistic materialist point of view, which is a specific form of materialism, animism is also another form of materialism, right?
Can be, yeah.
Coraism. Um, but I think he's setting up that framework because it is, I think, still even 30 years later, it's less so now because, there are other options, I think, that disturb the assumption in the mid 90s still, and for much of the 20th century, that um, consciousness was a rude intrusion into an otherwise well-behaving universe, that we could understand in a functionalist way if we're talking about biology and neuroscience and cog sci and stuff. And Chalmers' point with that framing of the hard problem is just to say we could have a complete functional explanation of the brain and its environment and have nothing whatsoever to say about consciousness. And I think that makes sense from the materialist common sense. But if we're not going to accept that, then of course we don't have the hard problem. I don't personally have the hard problem, but I think pedagogically, I often begin with that just to make the um, just as a bridge and to help people who might have assumed that science and materialism are the same thing, materialism in the mechanistic sense are the same thing, to help them bridge to a more animist point of view.
Yeah, no, and it's useful for that. And I think from the animist point of view, it's just mistaken to say that you could have a complete functional explanation of the human organism and consciousness would play no role in that. Like I think
Yeah.
that's a false claim. And I also, of course, I've said this so many times, but I mean the way Chalmers formulates the hard problem initially, that it can't be a mechanistic and it can't be a functional explanation, but nonetheless it's a problem for science, is also the wrong way of formulating it, because
I agree. I don't think it's a scientific problem.
science deals in functional and
Yeah.
mechanistic explanations, and I
Mm,
think in animism you get a much broader sense of function or capacity, like powers and all of that sort of thing,
mhm,
um, which changes the scope of the question there. But I think even within a kind of standard kind of scientific paradigm, the way Chalmers formulates it, it's not designed to, because but it immediately gets scientists offside, because they're like, well, there are no other meaningful questions. If you're a positivist, there are no other meaningful questions. So
yeah.
you just told us it's not a meaningful question, or at least not a scientific question.
Yeah.
So then don't tell me it's my problem. Um,
I think we're, Whitehead just at the same, well, a few years before Wittgenstein says of what we cannot speak, therefore we must remain silent. Whitehead wrote The Concept of Nature in 1920. So almost when was the Tractatus was the late 20s, right? Can't remember right now, but um, Whitehead says that it's in a way you could easily mistake it for a kind of positivism because he says, look, science studies nature, and nature is what we are aware of in perception. We shouldn't be introducing mechanisms in science that are not just hidden from us for now, but in principle hidden from our perceptual capacity and including our extensions of perception. Nature is what we are aware of in perception. And with that definition, science, it's not that it can't explain mind. It's that it just presupposes mind. It presupposes the perceiver, it presupposes knowledge, that knowledge is possible. And the problem of how mind, in that sense of the knower, the perceiver, relates to what we are aware of in perception is a philosophical one. And so there's all, the difference with Whitehead from the logical positivist is he still leaves a lot of work for philosophers to do about how mind and
yeah,
nature relate. But he says, look, science is most productive when it's focused on what we are aware of in perception and finding systematic relationships among percepts,
yeah.
and come up with the best models to predict the percepts in their unfolding, um, in their systematic unfolding, and don't get mired in these false problems of trying to explain consciousness in terms of uh, the relationship among percepts. It's like
Mm,
you're not going to be able to do that. And don't invent matter as something behind percepts that's the
mm,
cause of percepts.
mm.
So it's Whitehead's position that I've seen mistaken for positivism, actually, but I think it's different in an important sense.
Yeah, and so just to return again, and then we should jump into the Deacon Levin thing, because
Mm,
there are a bunch of things that I want to say about silly things. No offense, Bernardo, that Bernardo said in that debate, in that discussion, like 99% of scientists would say that economics is reducible to physics, and I'm just like, what are you talking about, man? That's crazy.
yeah.
Basically denying existence to economics. Anyway, we don't need to get into that.
Right, right. Yeah.
History of false problems stuff still. Um, because there's a couple of things that I still want to say about that. I mean, one thing, just to get back on the mechanical philosophy, it's always, even though we talk about onto-epistemologies, and there are very important and principled relationships between ontology and epistemology, and we can't let the two things drift apart. We also don't want to conflate a methodological principle with a we don't want to reify it as an
Mhm.
logical given or a fact or something like that. And I
Yeah.
think we should all just read Rosenbluth and Wiener and we're going to talk about Wiener, I hope, in the discussion of Levin and Deacon, when we talk about information. And in fact, Wiener's critiques of Shannon information is
Mm,
very pertinent to what Terence Deacon was saying. But so obviously, was it Arturo Rosenbluth, Norbert Wiener, And this is kind of pre-cybernetic but foundational stuff for the cybernetic movement. Um, and just the role of models in science. That's the name of the little paper. It's very, very short, and everybody ought to read it because, it begins with this. I'll just quote really briefly. The intention and result of a scientific inquiry is to obtain an understanding and control of some part of the universe. This statement implies a dualistic attitude on the part of scientists. Indeed, science does and should proceed from this dualistic basis. But even though the scientist behaves dualistically, his dualism is operational and does not necessarily imply strict dualistic metaphysics. Um, and basically, they talk about, quite nicely about simplification and abstraction and the role of models, right? Uh,
Mhm.
and so the whole mechanical philosophy, in some sense, from the division into res cogitans and res extensa, which really is a methodological division, the kind of
It
ray of the
wasn't Galileo, but it became
yeah,
metaphysical in Descartes, I would say.
yeah, yeah. Um, Even though it's got that methodological, I mean, he has a methodological aspect to it, Descartes, and an ontological aspect to it, right? And I suppose he
Yeah.
does. And then it gets even worse with like, Julien Offray de la Mettrie and people who go like really, really hard on the mechanistic view. Although most of them are more nuanced, and I know you would always say this about Descartes, but are more nuanced than we give them credit if you actually go and read what they have to say. But a kind of
I love Descartes' phenomenology, but his ontology
yeah,
is terrible.
yeah, fair point. So I think really, if we just take that opening paragraph from The Role of Models in Science by Rosenbluth and Wiener, and we just take that seriously, we just note that, don't it may well be necessary to exclude an explanation of all of the kind of transcendental preconditions of the possibility of doing science and doing modeling in order to actually explain this little part of the world to some degree, and to develop obviously, cybernetics is a strongly instrumentalist movement, but to gain a kind of instrumentalist handle, control, of course, control theory develops out of cybernetics, over this little part of the world. We're going to have to bracket a lot of things in the world, including the investigator themselves. Famously, cybernetics has this second order movement, the inclusion of the cybernetic system, well, the treatment of the observer themselves as also a cybernetic system in relation to the cybernetic system that they're studying, and indeed the treatment, as Margaret Mead discusses, of the whole cybernetic movement, so the societies and their conferences and all of that as itself cybernetic, so this like nested recursivity. But Rosenbluth and Wiener are already just pointing to that there, and this is kind of pre Wiener's adoption of the term cybernetics. That yeah, we know, observers are of course part of and implicated in the observations that they're making, but we intentionally bracket them in order to create a kind of tractability. And then the problem only becomes, well, things only become a problem when we then read an ontology directly off the model. And that's one of the things that I'm always harping on about is with these variational principles, so precisely the kind of models that Wiener goes really hard on in cybernetics, but really that have this legacy from the development of probability theory and everything. There is always this, posit of the fixed state space over which you can calculate probabilities, over which there are distributions or paths and those sorts of things. And that's just how probabilistic methods, variational methods, go in their development. And for the developers of probability theory, that fixed state space kind of corresponds with the mind of God, because they were determinists, Laplace, Bernoulli, blah blah blah. I've said this many times, but uh,
Mhm.
it still is a very present problem. We could talk about the free energy principle. We're not going to, but when you take those models which are coming out of that legacy and that have a need to, in order to develop tractable equations, in order to develop useful models, they have to embed a bunch of assumptions. Read the footnotes in free energy principle papers. They do mention all of these things, Laplace normality, etc., mean field theorem, etc. Those are things you don't want to read off the model, Those things are there to make the model tractable, the ergodicity assumption, that you don't want to elevate into like ontological principles. And that's why there is always work for philosophy. There's always work on the
Mhm.
interpretive side of things. And it might also be why, some of these modeling programs, they sound amazing and they have the ring of truth to them, but they don't actually create, really, really useful models that could say, like, predict the evolutionary trajectory of an organismal lineage, or indeed predict an organism's behavior. They could give you a kind of vague set of principles about what an organism does in general. And of course, that's important. And I'm a big advocate of vagueness in fundamental principles, one, two, three, right? Variation, selection, inheritance. But don't confuse that with a complete description or a complete explanation of the target system. So that's just I guess I got here on history of false problems and stuff. Studying the history of the development of formalisms is also kind of important to me. And then really last point on this, because you were talking about aim and trying to get away from the hylomorphic principle where an aim is, you were talking about an architect basically designing a house and building a house, and that's not,
Yeah.
we shouldn't use that model for understanding why there are eyes basically. And I think one of the reasons we do have to, we don't want to slingshot all the way to the other side of things where we imagine that Darwin wasn't naturalizing purpose but eliminating purpose, which is just complete nonsense because he's naturalizing purpose. So the whole purpose and mattering is just a intrinsic part of the evolutionary logic. Adaptation. Darwin is not an adaptationist, but adaptation is, of course, an intrinsic part of the mode of reasoning there. So don't slingshot all the way over, but also we need to notice that to get out of that, incredibly, canalizing ancient lineage of hylomorphic thought based on a designer who imbues a material with form, we do need to go pretty hard on some of these things because our thought is so when we are, minimizing discussion of aims, or we're excluding that from a certain context of discussion or whatever it might be, or we want to say things like goals don't go all the way down, Michael Levin. Um, you know, uh, Part of that is that there's a historical legacy of ways of thinking that we are concerned to ensure we're not going to keep getting recanalized by, recaptured by, because those
Mhm.
attractors in thought space are incredibly powerful because, they have dominated the whole of, like, in this case, Western thought, if we're talking about hylomorphism, like since, the fourth century before the
Yeah.
Common Era. That's just the
Yeah.
way we've thought about these things. And
Yeah.
so,
Language is just our language is not that different from DNA that we inherit,
yeah.
and it shapes the phenotypic expression of our
And it's
discourse.
a set
Yeah.
of enabling constraints, right? It's not a bad thing intrinsically, and we need it. But at the same time, we've got to, keep trying to discover novel lines of flight, degrees of freedom, and going back and studying the history is
Yeah.
an important way of doing that. It's like, why was that technical schema of like brick molding or whatever? Why was that the fundamental example that was used in the development of the holomorphic theory? And blah 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 blah, like, by understanding why it was used and in fact how it fails to even capture, Simondon is just so good on this, how it fails to even capture the realities of brick molding itself, like how it's a very abstract version of what's going on there. And there are reasons for that abstraction because there's a sociocultural context, in which, again, it's taken for granted that there is a divine, imbuer of forms and eternal forms and blah blah blah. Studying all of that helps us to discover degrees of freedom to kind of move beyond it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, well, first of all, I think as a philosopher, I know that I'm not at all equipped to actually construct useful models in physics. I'm not a mathematician. Biology, I can start to get more of a grip on the technical details of the models. Psychology and cog sci, I feel more equipped. But really, as a philosopher, I feel like my main concern is, as Whitehead would say, I feel like a critic of abstractions. and I feel like I am on the lookout for misplaced concreteness in the way that the models subtly shift from just being instrumentally useful to being uh, existentially explanatory,
Yeah.
where there's a the model becomes, or the hypothesis becomes hypostatized. It becomes equated with what's real, because then all of a sudden, there are um, consequences for the consequences of model reification are, you could end up providing cover for certain political and economic and social ideologies.
Mm.
And while science does provide us, I do believe I'm a scientific realist to some degree. I think science provides us with access to a natural world independent of our social and political and economic ideologies. But I also think social and political and economic ideologies shape science and scientific research, obviously scientific funding, you know, deeply. Um,
And philosophy.
yeah, you're right. But we don't there's less. I feel like philosophers a little bit more outside the economy. We're not particularly valued or getting
A
paid very
very
much.
a very Bergsonian position for you to take, that philosophy is valuable precisely because of its uselessness.
Yeah, no, I do tend to take that position when I don't even need to be backed into a corner, but when, philosophy is forced to justify itself as being a legitimate university department because it's producing, it's training people for jobs that allow them to make a living. I'm like, I mean, I think it's good for democracy, maybe, if we still care about that. But
What living are you talking about? Which philosophers are these making a living?
yeah,
I'm kidding.
yeah. But my point is, I'm not equipped to actually um, do the experimental work and construct the models that are properly speaking scientific. Like, not capable of that. But I think that the role of the philosopher in a scientific age is to be the critic of abstraction and to be the sort of the guardian of not just common sense, but also of imagination from the temptation at scientific reduction, because obviously science, technoscience, is extremely powerful. And it's powerful because there's a lot of truth in it. It's gotten a grip on real features of the universe. And we need to reckon with that as human beings and not remain attached to, you know, pre-scientific um, pre-scientific abstractions. But science has its own abstractions
Definitely.
and its own idols. And I think this is the enduring relevance maybe of negative theology, right? Which was, I think, before even the reification of scientific models, negative theologians had come up with a way of inoculating the religious mindset against um, mythic, uh, misplaced concreteness. Um,
Yeah. I mean, that's the Prasangika is the, you know, as the reductio wielders is kind of the apotheosis of that trajectory. You wouldn't
mhm,
call it negative theology as such, but
mhm.
it is, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and that was something else I had made a note about to talk about Buddhism and the atheism, or at least agnosticism, if you're a strict, Madhyamaka skeptic.
Mhm.
You wouldn't be an atheist necessarily, you'd be agnostic, I guess. But that, there was a point where Bernardo said very early on in the debate that, we're never going to get around the West, he says, will always try to find ultimate reality. And
Mm.
I don't know that there are plenty of Asian traditions that want ultimate reality, so I wasn't quite sure. But this idea that there is this obsession, probably it's already there in in theism to some degree in medieval theism, but I think it also manifests in modern science, this need for the theory of everything, basically. The monotheistic one God, to rule them all is structurally and logically not all that different from the theory of everything. And I
Yeah.
think so Bernardo's capturing something there, though I still think there are schools of thought, in Asia that would similarly want like the final answer.
Well,
Uh,
and there's negative theology, as you were saying, which is guarding against that
mhm.
Western
Right.
tradition. And of course, it's not at all coincidental that the theory of everything and the monotheistic, omnipotent, omniscient, blah, 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 go
Mhm.
have such a strange, isn't it strange that they have this resemblance? Isn't it weird how determinism is really similar to omnipotence? It's like these are theological ideas which continue to, canalize the history of scientific thought. I agree with everything that you're saying, and I think that when I'm critiquing abstraction in science, I'm just being more philosophical at that time. Uh,
Mm.
whether I'm a I mean, whatever. I'm just what I am. Um, that wasn't meant to be a God reference. I am that I
No, but I think yeah, you are a philosopher, Tim, and a scientist. I'm just a philosopher.
am. But I think, and I know it goes without saying that I'm also this person who compulsively needs to say the things that go without saying. Uh, all of what you were saying about science, which is very true about science, is also, of course, equally true about philosophy, in the sense that, the fallacy of misplaced concreteness is a pretty big deal in the history of philosophy. And
Mm.
even people who propose such fallacies and coin them in such pithy ways might not entirely be, free
That's
of
fair.
such
Don't make me read 3 pages of process and reality to you right now.
a. I mean, if it's going to be from the first, 25 or 30 pages, that's my favorite section. Just because it's all the fallibilistic, philosophy of science stuff, which I think is great. I mean, I think that Whitehead, to me, he's very much on the sort of Svatantrika side, in the
Mm.
sense that
Yeah.
he does affirm a certain kind. He affirms the fallibilistic principle of the non-completability of metaphysical systems and philosophical systems in general. And kind of he says things like every proposition, must be up for, debate or whatever. So I think he's a good fallibilist in that sense, as kind of like all right-thinking people are. He's not a dogmatist, but then he goes as hard as he possibly can on completing his system, right? And that's, I think, it's a kind of instrument. It's very Popperian, not, you know, uh, that he's taking anything from Popper, obviously, because he's working before. But it's in a sense, making the system as precise and complete as possible should make it more vulnerable to refutation. But I think Whitehead does try really, really hard to complete his system, despite his building in of certain kinds of incompleteness. So he's not a determinist, but I think in the Platonic sense, and Plato is not a determinist either, but in the Platonic sense, like Plato in the Timaeus is trying to provide a complete cosmological scheme. Um, and I think that Whitehead is very much working in that tradition, and I think that's why he makes use of the primordial nature and the eternal objects and etc. in the ways that he does. Is that he's trying to get this completely coherent and
Yeah.
thus
See, I would say he is definitely in the Platonic lineage, but because he's only offering a likely story.
yeah, no, but that's it. I mean, that's perfect. But I'm not disagreeing with that. That's the fallibilistic aspect. Plato's self-undermining,
Mhm.
so and therefore kind of evolutionary in this sense, like he's allowing the thought to evolve, but he's still trying to complete the system. And even after well, if it's after whatever, but in the Parmenides, when Socrates basically takes the Timaean system to Parmenides and is like, hey, this is the theory of forms. What do you reckon? And Parmenides is like, well, you have a big problem here about the nature of participation because, how do these disparate principles interact with each other? And then Plato and Socrates is like, oh, you're right. I do need to complete my system. Um, hence the one. So there is a continual move to try and complete things. I'm not against that. I'm not saying that I'm against that, but I am saying that those are the things that I criticize Whitehead for because,
Yeah.
and I think that's what they're there for. If
But I
he's a
actually, yeah,
fallibist.
yeah. So I think, going back to the soteriology
Mm.
um idea that I started us with, I think Socrates and Buddha are not all that different if you think about Socrates' relationship to the physiologoi.
I
One,
agree.
all of a sudden ethics is first philosophy for Socrates. Whereas it's not that ethics was ignored by Heraclitus and then, Thales and the other guys. It was that they were more concerned to know the truth about nature, about the cosmos, and they didn't yet, I don't think, have a differentiation between truth and beauty. Like the truth about the cosmos and the beauty of the adornment of the visible world were compact for them. And Socrates comes along and says, but what about you and your knowledge and what you are to do in this polis? Um, it starts to be more focused on individual souls all of a sudden and your ethical responsibility rather than your knowledge of the truth and feeling of the beauty of the cosmos. Not that that gets eliminated. I mean, Plato has a lot to say about that. I think the Socratic tradition still has a lot to say about nature, but always, I think, framed in as a secondary to the ethical question, which is what
But
is good life?
is there not a real historical distinction here between Socrates, as we know him through Plato and Xenophon, and
Mhm.
Plato? And the Socrates that I'm referring to in the Parmenides dialogue is
Yeah,
not, that's Plato.
that's Plato.
That's
Yeah, yeah,
Plato's mouthpiece.
yeah.
And so I think from what I understand, or the image that I get of Socrates, the historical person who never wrote anything, um, is very much what you're saying, is very much in very similar to the Buddha in that sense, and is a kind of critical, negative, the truly Socratic dialogues end in aporia, um, uh, you know, reflection on the positive philosophy of the physiologo. So it's almost a completely critical philosophy. It's a reductio philosophy. It's like you don't even know what you're talking about because you don't even know what these words mean. Uh, like, um, and I very much appreciate that. I think what kind of is weird for me, and I think we should get on to Levin and Deacon and probably not get mired in this too much, but I think
Mhm.
what's interesting for me is that because Socrates centers things back on the individual person again. When Plato then tries to do the complete synthesis, and he wants to do the metaphysics as well as the personological side of things, it actually ends up being even more projective. This is almost like what Schelling is saying in
Mhm.
that fragment on the fragment on the Timaeus, but that thing on the Timaeus that we read.
Yeah.
He kind of
He's
says that
like 14, but yeah.
Plato, Plato is a
19, I think, really, but
yeah, 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 yeah. I mean, he's a prodigy, but let's not go too far. Where he's sort of saying that Plato is a kind of, Kantian, um, is
Mhm.
a transcendental philosopher. Is he making the point that I mean, he's saying that don't reify Plato's categories as metaphysics because they are psychological categories, and so it's just it's just wrong to read him as though he is proposing a positive metaphysical scheme. But if he is, to the extent that he is, it is a very kind of projectionist. Because he is basing his understanding of, I mean, it's a hermetic in the microcosm macrocosm way. He's basing his understanding of the cosmos on his understanding of the psyche. Um,
Yeah. It's projective in the Jungian sense
yeah,
of an anamnetic method,
yeah, yeah.
um,
And I don't think that's intrinsically bad. I think this is why, and we're not.
that's good.
Well, no, it's bad. It's rare. This is fallacy of misplaced concreteness again. So
Mhm.
if you were to reify the method, or the projective content essentially in this case,
Mhm.
to me that's the problem.
Mhm.
Doing that isn't the problem. So what I like about Jung and why I always think people should read Jung through the method, like don't ignore the places where throughout his career, sorry, Bernardo Kastrup, the only book of his that I own is Decoding Jung's Metaphysics, right? And I take exception even to the title, and I haven't read the whole book, but don't ignore the parts all throughout Jung's career where he says, I'm not a metaphysician, I am an empiricist, and
I'm a physician.
I'm a physician, exactly, and I do all my work through this, physician's stance, essentially. Um, and so I have this principle of psychic reality that must not be confused with metaphysics, right? And of course, if you ignore that kind of bracketing move that Jung does, or worse, if you say, oh, well, that's just him backsliding and blah, blah, blah. I mean, people say that a lot. Um, if you ignore that, I mean, you're obviously ignoring Jung's own, injunction to pay attention to it. But of course, if you read Jung, you're going to be able to say, "Oh, this is all metaphysics," and look, he's a metaphysician, and blah 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 blah. If you choose to ignore his own methodological stricture,
Sure.
and you can, of course, read an implicit tacit metaphysics of what Jung is saying, obviously, but you just need to recognize that that's not Jung's metaphysics per se, because as he says, I'm not a metaphysician, but I do have this principle of psychic reality. So I treat all of these contents of the psyche as real in a psychic sense, and I'm very on board with that actually, personally. It's just I have an issue with that little move where we go, oh, well, in fact, because this is psychologically real, it's ontologically real. And to me, that's not dissimilar to reifying the content of an effective theory, because I do think psyches, like organisms as a whole, are, and would be a free energy principle kind of point, but again, without reifying the free energy principle itself, are effective theories of their environments. Um, and
Yeah.
this would also be the Peircean sense in which they are arguments. But organisms are constructed through this process of concrete abstraction, which is very much related to the way we build an effective theory. But if you then simply read the ontology off the effective theory, like from within the effective theorization, which is your psyche, that's that projective fallacy, and that's actually the fallacy of misplaced concreteness again, just in a different way. And that's
Mhm.
why I like Prasangika as well. And why Jay Garfield's perspective, and I mean, he wrote this beautiful essay on Vasubandhu, the Yogacara philosopher, a Buddhist, and illusionism in the special issue of I think it's Journal of Consciousness Studies, but edited by Keith Frankish, called Illusionism. And just like the best essay in there is, for me anyway, not that I actually even read them all, but is so you can take my opinion as always with a huge handful of salt, a shovel of salt.
Mhm.
But he wrote this beautiful essay on Vasubandhu in there, and kind of Vasubandhu's illusionism. And I mean, it's almost enough to make you an illusionist. Like I know you have said many times that you think there's a lot in common between process relational philosophy and illusionism, but there are certain key points of difference, and I would completely agree with that. Like I don't like the name
Keith
illusion.
Frankish and I did a lot of translation when we had a chat.
And
So
it was a beautiful conversation, and Keith actually seems like a really wonderful guy.
mhm.
Um, So anyway, I guess that's all a digression, but I think that fallacy of misplaced concreteness can like any kind of foundationalism is going to be committing that kind of fallacy. And so
Mhm.
if you're reifying the content of your psyche or the content of a mathematical model or whatever it is, or just whatever you've received from some sociocultural context, and let's not forget about Rainer Sherman and his notion of the philosopher as civil servant. So that in some sense, philosophers have often had the role of like shoring up the kind of status quo, like
Yeah.
giving a kind
Oh,
of
that's
metaphysical
what
ground.
Hegel does with his philosophy of right.
Yeah. So yeah, fallacy of misplaced concreteness is all over.
Okay. Yeah. What about Deacon and Levin? Let's just do a hard pivot. I mean,
Those guys. Yeah.
it's related because I think, okay, maybe this is a segue. Emptiness in the Buddhist sense, and what Deacon means by absence.
Uh,
Um, he even makes the reference to Taoism, I think, in Incomplete Nature. And I guess it's a Taoist metaphor of all of the work that's done by the space in the middle of a wheel.
yeah.
Um, that it plays a very important role in allowing a wheel to be a wheel, and yet there's actually nothing there.
That's dukkha though. Dukkha, you mentioned it being associated with being in a crowded space. Another thing that it's always associated with is the wheel, the axle wheel relationship that is imperfect. So there's a
Mm.
certain,
A wobble.
and it's like it's constitutive, you can't make it perfect. It's
Right.
always going to be there, and you kind of just have to learn to live with it in some sense.
So yeah,
It,
there's always this disequilibrium, and yet there's also this role that absence plays to grease the wheel, to
yeah,
allow things to fall.
to
As
really
Deacon,
jump, to really jump but
oh, I
the
thought that
deep
was a good segue, but okay, go ahead.
really, I'm gonna let you get right back to it. But the disequilibrium, far from equilibrium, we're all this is just a drive theory and the notion of suffering. Like there is a soteriological aspect almost to this kind of thermodynamic view of life. We're always grasping, we're always stuck in that position, which might be described as primal confusion to some extent, but of thinking we need something, but we do, we are completely dependent on like environmental sources of energy and blah blah blah. Anyway, that was a weak jump, but you continue.
No, I mean, I think the way that Terence Deacon tries to describe a process uh, by which thermodynamics and entropic gradients can become about themselves, as he puts it. And
Mhm.
he read Peirce very early on. I know he read Whitehead too, but he has his criticisms of Whitehead that are not dissimilar from your own that I have tried. Like, I'm not going to say that sentence. That's too arrogant. We have had a conversation about Whitehead where I think he's misunderstanding Whitehead, um, but in a way that is easy to misunderstand him. It's the same issue you have that, like, as if there were a finite number of eternal objects, and that you might run out, and that Whitehead somehow limiting creativity by saying that there's a realm of eternal objects envisaged by the divine, which is a
You're gonna have to let me respond to that. That's not
okay.
that's not exactly my critique.
Mm,
I'm saying that there is a formal relationship between the move Whitehead makes between in the relationship between the primordial nature and its envisagement of
right.
the
And Laplace, right?
Laplace, right? But I don't think Whitehead is describing the same kind of finite state space. But there are also lots of ways that infinities are built into those state spaces, right? There's this, interesting formal relationship between infinity and finitude, an infinity that actually guarantees the finitude of the calculation. And ergodicity would be a classic example of
Mm,
that. These kind
mhm.
of reliance on laws of large numbers type arguments where I call them tacit infinities, but I mean we don't need to necessarily go into that. But I don't think Whitehead is Laplacian. I think that there's too much in common in a certain sense, and I
Mm.
think he also has to erect his principle of the infinity of eternal object in order to avoid this concern. And I'm like, you don't actually need that because eternal objects are just continuously generated, essentially, right? Like they're generated by this process of actualization. Anyway, we don't need to get into that right now, anyway.
It certainly is, I think, a legitimate description of what it looks like from our perspective as actual beings that
So you're saying I'm the one indulging in the projective fantasy.
if you really we have to reach out to the psychoid and recognize that
But what is the psychoid? The psychoid, it's that's a vitalist principle,
I'm
coming
happy. Yeah, I'm happy with vitalism. If you want to,
coming from
if
Dreich.
the evolutionary biologist wants to defend vitalism, I'm on board. I've avoided it because I'm worried it would be that the biologists would peg me as anti-scientific.
Yeah, but those biologists, what do they know? Well, I'm going to have to, because you asked me to defend vitalism at this biophilosophy conference in July.
Please.
And I'm going to defend a particular reading of vitalism, animism, and materialism, which just
Mhm.
shows that like these things can all get along, essentially, that these are complementary principles. But yeah, the psychoid, the Dreichian psychoid, Hans Dreich, the embryologist, Jung gets the idea from. It is just that principle of like generative change in some sense. It's like what it is to be living is to be, and or like psyche, like in this case, is to be, continually changing in some kind of not necessarily intrinsically creative manner. Well, I guess it's creative because it's creating new states. So it's Elan Vital-esque.
Yeah.
Uh,
Self-moving. I mean,
yeah,
that's what Plato meant
yeah, yeah,
and Aristotle meant by psyche, self-moving.
exactly. Yeah.
Um, so, I mean, just to go back to Deacon, this account he tries to offer of thermodynamics and then morphodynamics and then intentionality,
Yeah.
and he tries to describe a process whereby without any kind of skyhook in Dennett's sense, you could start to get these loopy thermodynamic far from equilibrium processes whereby energy begins to fall up, I think is how he puts it in Incomplete Nature. Um, where because of the accumulation of adaptive constraints, you start to get processes which are self-perpetuating, self-moving, if you will. And he Deacon's critical and incomplete nature of Whitehead, he calls it a homuncular explanation because he thinks Whitehead's just presupposing at the beginning in matter what needs to be explained, which is this self-propagating capacity. And I
Mm.
think um, I I think that we can't there's no scientific way to decide this question of whether self-propagation, self-movement begins with biology or whether it was always already there in the physical world. Because from my point of view, and I'll use your term, an animist, as a vitalist, there is no materiality and there is no material process which isn't already in some sense self-organizing or organized,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
And so
Or, and also just to say, in the colloquial, most trivial sense, animate.
animate. Yeah. Like I was saying before, even light, even photons are already directive. Like there's a vector quality to even the simplest forms of energy.
Yeah.
And that's all you need. And that vector quality, you could say, is just a entropic, um, spreading out, cooling
Yeah.
down, but it's
And
still
also,
directional.
yeah. Well, and also just nothing is moving them.
Right. Yeah.
Self-moving, right? It is their nature to move. Like,
Yeah.
how would you even define light without the notion of, you know, its speed of travel, etc. And you actually said this really beautifully in your discussion of the waves and the water, and that
Mm.
really there would be no point, um, no matter how much we zoom in, at which there would be no motion, there would be no or activity, if we want,
Right.
or animacy in some very trivial sense. We're trying to obviously play with it rhetorically because there's this, classical or traditional division between the inanimate and the animate, but in also in the very colloquial, even more outside of that context, sense of something being animated. There are no things that aren't moving um, on some scale. Like things that appear still to us appear that way because of a phenomenon of scale, because of a reference frame.
Mm.
Either we're moving with them in an exact one-to-one, we're on the planet. It feels like it's not moving to us because we're on it. We're moving in sympathy with it. Um, or things are just moving at scales that we can't perceive, which could be
Yeah.
either too fast or too slow.
So I think and I know you have a lot more to say about Levin and Deacon, we can transition there, but I think where Whitehead is very much unlike Laplace and Newton is that for Whitehead, the source of invariance is not some law, nor is it some corpuscle, some material atom that endures through time as unchanged as a kind of mini substance. For Whitehead, what's invariant is um, these definite potentials, not something actual, not an
Mm.
actual law, not an actual particle. or a body of some kind. But the invariant elements are these eternal objects, which are pure possibilities. And I
Mm.
think that might seem logically equivalent or structurally isomorphic to what Laplace is doing. But I think it makes a huge difference because there is no room left over in the Laplacian or the Newtonian universe for anything like potentiality or possibility. And we can quibble about the definiteness or vagueness of possibility, which is an important point. But I really don't think what Whitehead is saying about eternal objects and the primordial nature of God is really isomorphic to Laplace. It's not even an inversion of Laplace. It seems to me quite different because of the emphasis on the polarity between the potential and the actual. Everything's actual in Laplace and Newton. The laws, the particles, it's all actualized. Space, time, there's no potentiality.
Right, but so there's an abstract isomorphy, and isomorphies are always abstract.
Mhm.
Um, well, that's a big claim, but come at me. This is a kind of identity of indiscernibles claim as well. Um, but there, and I totally grant that, of course, Whitehead is not Laplacian, um, in the sense that the Laplacian determinism is the kind of classic modern form of determinism, which is, of course, a version of the problem of theodicy, which is that give me the initial conditions or the boundary conditions. Position and velocity of all the particles, all the assumptions that are built in here in any given time slice, and the entailing laws, which are formal causes. Sorry, Hans Jonas, you don't understand. Um, those are formal causes. Laws are formal causes. Actually, Sheldrake and Vernon got onto this, and they were referencing what's his face. What is his name? All things are full of gods.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. David Bentley Hart.
Yes, and they were saying that he was noting how laws in the kind of modern sense are formal causes, which is absolutely right. Which I think that Hans Jonas absolutely misses if people want to watch that conversation that we
Mhm.
had. Um, so yeah, okay, Laplace is completely deterministic because the formal cause is fixed for all time, and it's absolutely canalizing. There's only one possibility for the pathway. The pathway of the entire universe is completely canalized, and that's not Whitehead at all.
Well,
That's and
Laplace says there are no gaps anywhere for freedom or
yeah, yeah, yeah.
spontaneity to sneak in, and Whitehead says all there are gaps. I mean, that's what an actual entity.
No, I totally get why but I'm speaking in a very abstract and formal sense about the relationship between the what Whitehead achieves in the act of Earth framing. So the
Mhm.
way Whitehead solves the frame problem cosmically, with his primordial nature and looking through these definite eternal objects and giving this initial relevance of them, organizing that he's the possibilitect, as you like to say. He organizes, he's the relator god. He puts them in relation in a certain way, and without that everything would fly off in all different directions, chaotically. And I'm just like, no, those I don't think we need those assumptions. And I do think Whitehead, great mathematician that he is taking thought forms which owe something to Laplace, because everybody's bloody mathematical thought forms owe something to Laplace in the history of, post-Laplacian metaphysics, including the use of probability theory, of which he is a primary architect. And I think Whitehead is thinking with those thought forms, even though he's perturbing the Laplacian ontology in all sorts of ways. So it's a kind of I don't know. I need to substantiate this claim more, but I'm saying that there's a real resemblance here between the thought forms, not with really what's done with them. But yes, we can quibble about the definiteness and vagueness. That's not a quibble.
No,
That's the
no, that's
that's the
yeah.
that's
We'll
the
do,
key point.
we'll do another
Um,
3 hours just on that at some
yeah,
point.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So I mean, pure possibilities. That's to me, again, I'm not claiming to be in possession of the perfect dictionary, but the way I define possibility is that it has a certain degree of of definiteness to it, yeah, is that it has a certain degree of definiteness to it, as opposed to potential, which could be completely indeterminate. Um, and so, I prefer to speak in terms of virtual and actual. I prefer to avoid substantializing these terms. I prefer to say that they're just operators, right? Because I think we get into a lot of problems when we substantialize them, even though that's a separate issue from the one that we're talking about right now. So I think that the term pure possibility is kind of a like contradiction in terms, because I think that things only get that definiteness, which is characteristic of a possibility or indeed an object, in a relational manner. You'll say that they do that because that's the relationship with the primordial nature of God, right? Um, and so, yes, in a relation to a specific actual situation, the primordial nature of God in this case, you have a relative definiteness of possibilities, adjacent possibilities that again
Yeah.
receive their definiteness, relative definiteness, and thus their status as possibilities as opposed to just pure indeterminacy, because of their adjacency with a particular actual situation. And I
Yeah.
don't and the problem with the primordial nature of God then, because it kind of conforms with all of this, because that is the point. It's an actual entity or that is correlated with all these, is that there are just there's an infinite range of possibilities correlated with that, which means that that primordial nature itself has to be infinitely complex, because the definiteness has to
Mm.
be derived from the
Mm.
definiteness of possibility has to be derived from definiteness, determinacy in actuality. And so I'm like, this is really, really front loading the possibility landscape here. And I just don't think you need to do that, because I think that the primordial actuality, if we're going to think cosmogenesis, and we should only think that as a limit concept and kind of apophatically, ultimately, the whole point of erecting a positive thesis in cosmogenesis is essentially to show how none of them work. Like you can't think absolute origins because you're now at the limit of thought, and you're
Mhm.
discovering that limit, and then being thrown back onto conventionalism and all of that. And again, I will agree that Whitehead is kind of doing that. Like this is a Svatantrika or a fallibilist erection of a positive thesis. But I think what it shows to me is that if you're going to think this arrangement of a primordial actuality and its association with thus a possibility landscape, which has some degree of definiteness in it, it has to be maximally simple.
Yeah.
Um, and so it cannot, so then you don't have an infinite array of
But the
death.
primordial envisagement, I think, is actually simple. It's the consequent nature that becomes complex. Um,
That's fine. But then that again, it's the way that eternal objects have their pre-definiteness in
mm.
correlation with that absolutely simple primordial nature that just doesn't work like that for me. Um,
They only have a pre-definiteness from relative from one actual occasion, finite actual occasion to another finite actual occasion, which is just to say, like, the past is given, would be another way to say that. And so I don't actually think Whitehead's in disagreement with you, or that I'm in disagreement with you. I think what he means by general potentiality or pure potentiality is creativity.
yeah.
And God is the first simple, maximally simple um, ordering of that potentiality. So that it becomes a given primordial fact that all subsequent actual occasions inherit.
Yeah,
Uh,
and I'm actually fine with it when it's put that way. I
mhm,
just think that again, we probably shouldn't keep getting into the minutiae here. I think that there are lots of attendant things that Whitehead says and that you often say,
mhm.
which don't follow from that statement, you know, that there must be some primordial actuality, again, if you're thinking cosmogenesis, that it must be maximally simple. Therefore, it's haloed like every actuality by possibilities. Like you can go here this way or that way from any given situation, from any concrete situation, so to speak, right? There are degrees of freedom associated with it because we're not actualists, because we're not determinists. Um, and all of that is fine, and I agree with that. And here we converge on something which we've talked about many times, which would be the primordial God. The function or the operation as an operator is an attractor selector or an canalizer. And of course, to have the kind of process relational view that we both have and to think cosmogenesis in that context, that is the thought form that you're going to be thinking, I think. It's just that Whitehead really seems to front load it when he needs to posit this primordially infinite landscape of eternal objects, you know. And then
Yeah.
all these issues about the immortality, like the past is given, the past cannot be changed, but there are all these issues about the immortality of the past, which for me are also big sticking points. There's also the Leibnizian principle that every actual object ingresses the whole array of um, uh, like every
Internal objects. Yeah.
yeah, but with a ordered degrees of relevance, and I'm like, you don't need that either, in my opinion. That's very abstract, and I think not everything is related to everything else. And of course, again, the limit concept of that is what I call Bohmian lockstep, which again becomes another kind of actualist determinism. And I grant that Whitehead has his various elements of his scheme to prevent some of the infelicitous consequences of the thought forms that he is taking from the history of like either philosophy or mathematics and logic that he borrows from. And he very eloquently creates this thing, and then he sees the negative consequences, and he tinkers here and he puts in another principle to ensure that we're not going to collapse into some kind of actualism or determinism or whatever. But some of those things are problems that he just created for himself, in my opinion, by taking too much from that history in some sense, like that yeah.
Well, he's a Bergsonian philosopher, in the sense that he thinks that the highest achievement a philosopher can hope for is to create their own problems, right?
Yeah, nice. Yeah. And we talked a lot about
If you want to
Plato.
think in original ways, you have to create your own problems.
And I think all of the philosophers that you and I talk about frequently and that we love are in exactly that, either in that lineage directly, so like Simondon and Bergson, who take their Simondon and Deleuze, who develop this concept of the problematic, and Simondon does a lot with that, and I think creates very new concepts on the basis of it. And Deleuze, when he writes about Simondon, recognizes that Simondon has done new things with that in this pre-individual field as a problematic field and all of that. But yeah,
Mhm.
the works themselves are that, and they would all agree with that. I mean, like Deleuze would say that, what is it, like a corpus, the work of a philosopher is nothing other than the, identification of some problems and the systematic, we said that very early on in like 53 in the Hume book. But
Mhm.
also, we said this about Plato when we were talking about the Timaeus, that Plato generates a problematic, which is clearly incredibly fecund, right? And this is also fallibilism. Every solution creates a new problem. That's Simondon's transductive series of individuations, because every individuation retains its charge, especially in the living world, retains its charge of the pre-individual problematic. So it has a new set of problems that are associated with it to the degree that it is a novel, that it is an individuation. It's a novel solution, and so it becomes this transductive series, and I just call that constructive evolution. Um,
Mhm.
so I agree with all of that. That none of that requires the immortality of the past, which is not what you said anyway. But that, I mean, when we're talking about Bergson in this context. But let's get back to Levin and Deacon.
Yeah.
So just to segue again there, although I just interrupted you, I'm very rude. But I don't know Deacon well, is the truth. Like I've had Incomplete Nature on my shelf for I don't know how long, and I've dipped into it a few times, but I've never really read it. I mean, I've gleaned a bunch about his basic principles from, um, dipping into it, from talking to various people. I have read a couple of papers over the years. I was quite interested in biosemiotics for a while, so I read a few papers, including a few Deacon papers. Obviously, I'm interested in Peirce a lot. I find biosemiotics often quite disappointing, but um, I think he and I would probably have and he obviously has it much more developed than I do, a kind of similar story about what I would call constructive coarse graining and the role of like non-equilibrium thermodynamics in trying to understand that bridge from the development of systems from a thermodynamic context perspective that, about for which things can matter, like their preservation can start to matter in a sense. That could be thrown back on the Peircean tautology, things which are good at persisting tend to persist, which is natural selection, the tautology of natural selection. What I thought was what I'd really like to get to as well, and just to introduce this, was the discussion of information in the Levin Deacon dialogue, because there are really fascinating resonances, I think, there with Simondon, but also it's more coming out of Wiener and Wiener's critique of Shannon. And Wiener didn't get mentioned by Deacon, but yeah, maybe that's somewhere we can go just to presage a few topic areas.
Yeah. Well, I'd be curious to hear what you thought about Deacon's, well, as I understood him, his attempt to distinguish between information and interpretation or evaluation, um, which is, I mean, it's kind of already implicit in Shannon with the difference just between meaningful information, the content of a message, and the energetic medium through which it's transmitted, the channel. And so I think maybe that's already implicit in Shannon, but he's not really he's not focused on the message. He's more interested in the medium.
Well, he's just explicitly excluding it, and I think that there are probably different ways of thinking about, channel and message entropy. But I mean, in the engineering sense, in the kind of fundamental framework that Shannon and Weaver develop, at least as I understand it, meaning is explicitly excluded.
Mm.
Um, and this is Wiener's critique, actually, even though Wiener is, of course, deeply, intimately familiar with the kind of formalisms they're developing, and does see it as a real achievement. Um, he has the immediate critique that, well, information is about something, and in your engineering scheme, you haven't included that kind of in your emergent definition of information. I mean, channel entropy is like the amount of entropy that a channel can transmit, while still retaining the capacity to transmit a signal. And message entropy is the entropy associated with the actual signal, right? So it might not be the message entropy in this case, because this is an engineering question, might not actually be making use of the bandwidth of the channel, right? So it could be a very inefficient use of a channel to transmit far less information than you can. But information is kind of here indexed to entropy. So the amount of entropy is the amount of information in a kind of isomorphic sense here for the Shannon-Weaver thing. And Wiener, who is like literally the guy who develops the mathematics for the Brownian term, the Wienerian term in a lot of these in like variational methods. He's still saying that. Yeah, obviously, I get the methods. It's clearly very useful for solving these engineering problems, but um, entropy is not information. Entropy is potential. So it's the potential for organization, um, and that organization of those degrees of freedom, which are there in the entropy, so in like the bandwidth of the channel, that will be, in fact, the information. So information is about a structure, which conveys a meaning. So it's about a structuring of entropy. The entropy itself, that could just be disorder, like a channel has the amount, can transmit this quantity of, we don't want to say information, but this quantity of information in the Shannonian sense. But he's like, that won't all be information, right? Information will be the constraint of that entropy. Um, which,
Yeah.
which I take it actually to be, this was not a very lucid way of articulating it that I just did, but I take it to be what Deacon is saying. And so I want to get to the way Simondon would say it, but I'll let you respond first. But I take it to be what Deacon is saying when he says that information itself, it has to be meaningful, right? Like it's not just, I don't think this is exactly what he said, but it can't be just that entropy.
Yeah. I mean, Deacon and Levin got into this dispute about how far down goals or teleology goes. And, Deacon said at one point that normativity or the idea of meaningful information only matters to the extent that there is um, a somebody to whom it matters. A um, what was the exact word that he used? A Yeah, I forget right now, but that they're a beneficiary was the word, I think. Who's the beneficiary of the distinction between meanings. And so, I think of Bateson's account of information as a difference that makes a difference. It implies this three-way relationship in Peirce's sense, that there's an interpretant interpreting a sign in relationship to an object. And that type of information can't be easily quantified, I think, because it's too perspectival, it's too subjective. Um, but it's essential to what we mean by life and by um, the maintenance of the metabolic cycles that allow for a horizon of concern to emerge. And
Mhm.
so this gap between information defined syntactically and information and semantic information, I think is a really it's a gap. It's a gap that I think some theorists have tried to leap. Um, but for me, it's another example of where we have to tread lightly and be very careful not to reify another kind of dualism between matter and life, um, between physics and biology, because there's clearly a difference between information that matters to a being that's trying to continue to self perpetuate its own existence and entropy.
Yeah. And I think Wiener would say that that's constitutive of the definition of information, that it matters, because it has a meaning, and it's functional.
Which
So
is so there's just to say these attempts at an information ontology that would try to use information to describe what physical reality is. I I am very ambivalent about that because on the one hand, it seems to me to imply experientialism, but
yeah,
only if you extend what Wiener is saying here.
yeah,
That it needs to be meaningful information,
yeah,
not just syntactic or
yeah.
not,
It
yeah, not just
can't
entropic.
just be like quantity of states, basically, and that would be there's this much of information. It's more like there's this much potential information, but this many states that could be meaningful to somebody, but they're not information intrinsically. Just because there's state A or state B is not intrinsically meaningful. So I think the way that I would think about this and kind of what Terence was saying was triggering in me was, I guess, the way that Simondon takes off from Wiener's critique of Shannon, and the way that information, and I'm going to use my own terminology, but both to safeguard my originality, but also not to say that Simondon is. I'll try and say where Simondon is actually saying this and where I'm saying what I'm saying, but I'm saying information has this important relationship to notions like, and I think this is very consistent with what Deacon is saying, constraint,
Mm.
um, form, so informants. This is Simondon's point in a very big way, and actually with selection. So information is a principle of selection, because what you've got in a kind of broadly Simondonian picture. Let's take an organism, so we just make it uncontroversial in terms of there's a meaning here or a mattering here, an aboutness to the signal or to the sign. So initially, you might think that the organism is the interpretant, and it is in a certain sense, but in fact, what the organism has within it for Simondon is this problematic field, right? This pre-individual problematic field of basically undirected variations. It's pre-individual in the sense that it is not canalized by the individual itself, right? Um, so there's all this spontaneous activity in organisms, whether that's, it's the stochasticity that I'm always talking about at all sorts of different levels. And really, we are talking about all sorts of different levels. People always want to reach for the random genetic mutation here, but it's stochastic, gene expression.
The intracellular matrix, just, yeah, things are banging around. Yeah.
They're banging around. Think molecules are moving in Brownian motion. There's all this stochastic spontaneous activity in like nervous systems, in brains, and behavior itself. Like I'm waving my hands like an idiot. This is basically stochastic behavior. Like a lot of our behavior is stochastic, and there's a kind of a principle. And again, these things are stochastic or undirected at their various levels, right? You can always go, back to like the laws of physics or something to make it silly and say, look, it is constrained. It's not random. That's to be missing the point completely. It's at a particular level of description where differences make a difference. It is a kind of pure difference, right? Um, and so part of the Simondonian thing here, which Deleuze takes a lot of, will be that, you have to have difference in order for a difference to make a difference, right? So you've got all of this spontaneous activity going on, and a signal or something happens, and that constrains all of that spontaneous activity. It selects a particular subset of it, and it's like, this is what you need to be right now, or this is the way you should go right now. So there's like a principle. Ants are such a good example of, like, when they set out foraging before they are canalized by something in the environment or by pheromonal trails from other ants or whatever, they're doing a random walk, they're just like going, they don't know where they're going. But there's a principle in behavior which is kind of like, when you got to go and you don't know where to go, you just go. So it's like, when you don't know what you're doing, you spitball, you throw something at the wall and see what sticks. This is actually very related to Persian abduction as well, obviously, which we've discussed in the past. But you put something out there, you're always palpating the environment, you're always probing it in some sense at all these different levels that we're talking about, and then you see what responds. But shifting the perspective to the perspective of the signal that's coming at you, that is not a response to you necessarily. You catch a scent, on the wind, you catch a scent trail on the ground, whatever. You see something coming at you. Something in the environment becomes a signal because of the way that it constrains all that spontaneous activity that's going on in you, and is like, this is the bit you need to deploy right now. So, it's like an elicitation from the environment. It's not a solicitation, and this is why it's not deterministic and why it's kind of meaningful and information, because meaningful and informational or informative, because it's not forcing you to be a certain kind of thing. It's kind of like, you have this capacity to be lots of different things. You have degrees of freedom, and the environment is eliciting from you a particular thing that would be the thing to be right now if you want to, avoid that predator, or, find that sugar residue, or, whatever it might be. Listen to someone speaking and have your, spontaneous brain activity canalized by their words, which is constitutive of learning in this medium or whatever. So it becomes a signal because of the way it selects, because constraint is selection, right? You've got a field of variation, um, and the signal is like this bit, right? This subset of that field of variation is now selected, and then that's amplified. And this is individuation for Simondon, right? The individual, who's already like an individual, right, but is still, this is, again, we're speaking about living systems, is charged by, has, retains inside it this charge of the pre-individual, this problematic field, and that's what enables it to become another individual, like a transductive series of individuations. And this happens under the influence of the environment, but it's he calls it an internal resonance, right? And this is why it's meaningful, right? the fact of that elicitation is contingent on the organism having the kind of variation in it that can be elicited in this manner, right?
Mhm.
So that there is a kind of thing to be right now, or a direction to go right now, is constitutive on the constitution of the organism, which is a kind of, he would talk about this a little bit in terms of the imprinting of the signal form. But basically, I guess in the Persian sense, then it gets a bit funny, because the pre-individual field of the organism is actually, in a sense, the object. The sign is obviously the thing happening in the world, which refers to that subset of the pre-individual field that is, I guess, now the object, right? And the interpretant is actually a transformative event, where the internal resonance between the structure or whatever, the form of that information, and the thing that's going on, the object, that subset of variation inside the organism, the internal resonance between those things elicits the next individuation. And that individuation is the process of interpretation, right? So the interpretant is not, as such, the static individual who receives a signal and is like, oh, yeah, I know what that means. It's that process of becoming a novel thing,
Mm.
which is how the Persian triads iterate, right?
Right. Yeah.
That the interpretant becomes the object for the next, round of individuations, or signaling, or whatever.
Yeah.
And
I mean, yeah, yeah. I think I don't, I wouldn't want to say the organism is the interpretant. I think the organism is the whole triad. The organism environment field is always
yeah,
it's the whole triad. And Whitehead has his version of that with of the triad with, objective data, subjective form, and superjective expression. Um, and that's um, I think a way of getting at this relationship between phylogeny and ontogeny, I think,
yeah,
where um, there was this moment when Deacon made this it was very, I would call it participatory insight that he articulates, where he says, every thought, I don't know if this is an exact quote, but he basically says every thought is a micro embryogenesis, or that,
yeah,
right, the process of ontogenesis is ongoing.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
and then our own experience of interpreting the meaningful information, in our environment is on ontogenesis. That's what we're involved in doing here.
yeah.
And he makes this great statement about speaking and language, and how he says a sentence before I speak it is undifferentiated.
Mm.
I don't know what I'm going to say until I say it. And as Whitehead puts it, I uh the end of a sentence, I complete a sentence um always in process, or I end a sentence because I have begun it in a certain way, but I don't know exactly where the sentence is going when I begin it. It just
Not
unfolds.
determined. It's not determined by the initial conditions, but it
Right.
is. It
Just
is an.
like ontogenesis is not determined by a genome.
Yeah.
Um,
We should definitely get into compression and decompression before we finish, by the way. But yeah, continue. Yeah.
yeah, and so it just has me thinking about the relationship between ontogeny and phylogeny in terms of what is actually more concrete and what is more abstract. And in terms of thinking about history, obviously we're always inheriting that history, but I've been thinking so much about you're harping on this point that, like, we never have there's no whole past that we get to just inherit moment by moment. And so this evolutionary history is there. It constrains us, but it's always broken and partial and
Yes. Degrees. Yes, exactly. Because
Mhm.
decompression is not one to one, right? When
Mhm.
we, I mean, that's jumping, because if anyone's actually listening at this point, they don't know about the compression decompression thing, which we'll get to. But
Well, presumably they would have listened to all four of these podcasts that we were talking about.
yeah, I mean, we haven't even mentioned the Jung one, and I think we won't, but
Yeah.
do that another time. I'll watch part two of that. And we've neglected the Vernon Sheldrake thing, which I thought was also a good chat.
Yeah.
But you want to keep going, or can I quickly rejoinder?
No, I mean, just I would love to hear your thoughts on ontogeny and phylogeny, and when we think about evolutionary creativity, I mean, the Evo Devo theorists are on about this all the time, that a lot of evolutionary novelty actually comes through in shifts in development, rather than mutations in the genes or something.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, and I'm always harping on, thank you, about that because when I talk about how people talk about quote unquote random genetic mutation as as like the source of novelty. I'm like, yeah, stochastic gene mutation, which is part of ontogenesis. I'm talking about actual Brownian motion of molecules, non-stereospecificity of molecules, the fact that any given molecule can stick to a whole bunch of different molecules and might indeed modulate them in some way, right? It's not that there's a one-to-one relationship between receptors and ligands. There's a
Yeah.
whole ton of stochasticity at that level, at the level of behavior. Stochastic, I mean, this is all behavior in some sense, by the way. Like some behavior is molecular and goes on inside you, and some behavior is the whole organism, but it's like stochastic in some sense, like, and so generative, in fact, right? Not fully constrained, degrees of freedom at all these levels. And a lot of what goes on in evolution is, I mean, where does selection actually operate on the organism, right? And of course, there are differing. There's a bunch of stuff that I want to get to in this which response, which I'll try and keep short. There are different ways of compressing information, and we're going to get to that.
Mhm.
Um, and the genetic compression of things that have worked in the history of a developmental history of the lifetime of a single organism, which is where selection is acting. Um, that's one mode of compression and one mode of inheritance, and it can do some things and it can't do other things, right? And that's one of the reasons why there's a proliferation of modes of inheritance or compression, like culture, for example, right? A lot of
Right.
things
So
which are
selection is
cultural.
not just acting, on the genome. It's acting also semiotically at the level of decisions that the organism's making.
Well, if my account of the nature of information was at all lucid, what I
Yeah.
was saying is that information is intrinsically selection, like those things, and constraint is selection. So those principles, I'm being abstract in a sense, but they can be mapped onto each other very, very closely, and that individuation, that transductive series of individuations, which I consider constructive evolution, is going on moment to moment. So I love what Deacon was saying about every thought being an ontogenetic event. That is just Simondon, not just. I'm not saying that he's taking it from him or anything. That's Simondon's view of individuation. That's even a Jungian view of individuation, but of course Simondon is deeply developing this with the thermodynamic schemas, with the information theory, with the cybernetics. So it's like, even though Simondon bizarrely, and maybe he never read him, never mentions Peirce, the resonances here are very, very, very strong. It's also very Ruyerian, of course, because for Ruyer, everything is embryogenetic in a sense, right? But this is this okay. So what were a couple of things I was going to say? Um, well, one thing to say in passing is, because we talk about abstraction, is that these are all also processes of abstraction, because selection is a process of abstraction, right? Because abstraction is a drawing away from. So if you have a field of variation and you have the selection of some subset of that, it's a kind of coarse graining in some sense, or a synecdoche, where that subset is now standing in for that field of variation, for that range of potential. It's the subset that's going to be actualized, which is not to say that the variational field was not itself in some sense actual, but this is why virtual and actual are operational, not substantial terms, for people following along with the metaphysics. But it's abstraction because it's drawing away that subset from its broader field, and it is concretizing it. It's like, this is now the subset that you are in fact going to be manifesting in some sense. But that's what we do in abstraction with a model, right? We say, okay, these are the variables that are most important for whatever study I'm doing. I'm going to abstract away from all the other variables. Here's my model. It captures certain variables with very high fidelity and just ignores other ones. That's a selective move, right? It's also why we can talk about things like selection bias in model, both model development, model selection, et cetera, right? Like selection, again, I'm not trying to water down these concepts to the point of absolute triviality, but I am, as this kind of, fundamentalist evolutionary thinker, also talking about how ubiquitous they are. So this kind of selection, the thing that information does as a constraint function, is also a kind of concrete abstraction. Um, so
Mhm.
so that is one thing that I wanted to say. And also just to say that we talked about it with an organismal example because it's very vivid to think about organisms individuating in this way. And we can point to, stochastic gene expression, blah, 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 blah. But this is also just what Simondon says is how information works in general, right? There is a necessity for this problematic field, which you can think of kind of analogous to um, Shannon's channel entropy. And I think it's really the way you were talking about the difference between channel entropy and message entropy, and even maybe the way Deacon was implying that they're different. But I don't think that is exactly the Shannonian sense. I think it's the way Wiener would talk about those two things being different, right? That the channel entropy is this potential, it's a set of states or degrees of freedom that can be constrained by the message, and that constraint function which selects some subset of that channel entropy, that is the informational content, which is non-quantitative in that sense. Like the information, it is quantitative in the sense that you have this big field of variation, and now you have some set of it, and you can quantify that, which is what message entropy is. But that's not the informational content. The information is in that resonance that we talked about, which is the way that the interpretant is this transformational thing. Now you know to go left instead of right, or whatever. Ontogeny and phylogeny. Oh, well, ontogenesis, just to say that just like Whitehead's whole philosophy is the philosophy of organism, Simondon describes his philosophy repeatedly as a philosophy of ontogenesis, right? So, I mean, it's a philosophy of individuation, but it's ontogenesis as metaphysics. And
Mhm.
ethics and everything. It's like a complete philosophy of, like, where ontogenesis is the kind of fundamental, or individuation, but these are basically the same thing. But he will use the term ontogenesis all the time in this regard. So just to point that out. Um,
Yeah.
so what's more abstract, though, you asked? On
Well, yeah.
yeah.
I mean, if we clearly all or each inherit a lineage, but there's a irreducible um stochasticity or um variability in the present that I think is manifest in ontogeny, but it's not simply it's not random. It's informed by the history and it's creative. There's a there's a capacity for improvisation that I think is suggestive of yeah, aim and a capacity to interpret and to semiotically imagine and abductively generalize or reason um, that to me is suggestive of something more than just the motion of molecules.
Yeah, because the motion of molecules in these set of analogies that we're making is the channel entropy, right? So it is undirected, and it's necessarily undirected. Otherwise, it wouldn't have the capacity to be canalized in a novel manner. If it were already completely canalized in a kind of Laplacian sense,
Mhm.
um, but this is also why.
Yeah, and there's not a master molecule who's driving, you
No,
know,
no, no.
who's
This is
steering the boat.
reciprocity between agent and arena, organism and environment, which is completely constitutive of this whole process, and indeed why for Peirce it's triadic. And that improvisation, though, is only possible because the whole of the past is not inherited at the at the kind of molecular, being just the generically lower or reductive level. Um, at
Mm.
whatever is your basement level, the
But
whole of
this is important. The Laplacian idea of determinism is based on the whole of the past without any gaps, just pushing the present forward.
yeah,
No room for alternatives.
yeah.
Whereas I think the idea from Bergson or Whitehead of the past being indestructible is the past as not just this already actualized plenum, but the past as real potentiality that's
Yeah.
recreated anew in each present.
Yeah, no, and I actually think it's a beautiful idea. I love the idea of durée, but
Mm.
I think that Bergson exploits a felicitous vagueness in his
Yeah.
formulation of that concept,
Yeah.
which, when made maximally precise, is kind of Laplacian, but it's not in the way that he talks about it. Um, maybe we get to that because there's thing that's very relevant to the compression decompression thing. I think I just want to respond really quickly to your ontogeny and phylogeny, what's more abstract thing. Um,
Mm,
so in what I was trying to get at there is that in a sense the process of selection is a process of abstraction. So they're both abstract. Um, they both are always a kind of, choosing of a particular subset of potentia, which is a kind of abstracting. And then phylogeny, like phylogeny, when we say that, we are, and when we separate the two, as opposed to just saying like ontophylogenesis, as someone like Jean-Jacques Cupiec would say, like that's a French biologist and philosopher of biology, who would just say that, and you can see this in some works from Mike Levin. You can obviously see this in the variational synthesis of the free energy principle. And I've been saying this for a very long time myself as well. Like, development is the evolution of the individual, I would say, right? Like there's no real principle difference. There's a difference in scale here, but there's also a difference in mechanisms of inheritance. And when we separate ontogeny from phylogeny in the way that the kind of neo-Darwinian synthesis has us do that, we are taking a particular mode of inheritance and saying, like, this is the defining, separating. But not all organisms really do that as much as we do. Like a lot of organisms develop more and evolve more through somatic mutations, and then like reproduce through fission and whatever. That's just one mode of inheritance. It's very important, and it's really, I think, very, and obviously a lot of my work has been on genetic inheritance, but it's very important, and it's fascinating and important to understand, what it can and can't do. But it's just a mode of inheritance. And one of the really powerful things, as I often say about Darwin, and his virtuous vagueness, his felicitous vagueness, is that he's not a mechanistic thinker, in the sense that he doesn't have a mechanism for inheritance, right? So he's got this triadic set of principles, essentially, selection, variation, selection, and inheritance. But because he doesn't um, know exactly how inheritance works in some mechanistic way, he's not tempted to abstract one form of inheritance and be like, this is the fundamental form, which is what the neo-Darwinian, which is really neo-Mendelian and Weissmanian or whatever, and actually hylomorphic. So where Darwin is kind of anti-hylomorphic in an important sense, at least the
mm,
principles are, because the form emerges from the variation, not the other way around.
mm.
Um, the neo-Darwinian synthesis is a massive resurgence of hylomorphism, because it's saying like, no, the genes imbue the matter. This information in the genes imbues the matter with form.
Right, right. Do you want to, before we wrap up, talk about Deacon's criticism of Levin as preformationist, because of the way he imagines these bioelectric fields? Levin responds, and I think points out that these are just set points that can be changed, and they're historically emergent and not necessarily fixed in some eternal sense. So he does have his own conception of the morphospace as a tron, but
Yeah, I think, well, I want to talk about compression and decompression if we can really quickly, but I think that, yeah, I think Mike is a bit of a preformationist, but I think Mike responded extremely well to what Terence said there, and demonstrated how, yes, it's the middle, because it's related to the decompression discussion. It's the middle of the bow tie. Like it is a state that is achieved, that's kind of reconstructed, um, and then it canalizes the things that are downstream of it, but it is itself the product of both an evolutionary history and a decompression process in the ontogenesis itself. So it's not eternal and sitting there the whole time. I think we see, to me at least, that, and far be it from me to say that I know the way the world works, but that Mike still has preformationist tendencies in the more recent discussion around, as you mentioned, Platonic morphospace. And when he's talking about things like order for free, referencing Stuart Kauffman, or Deacon brought up the lazy gene hypothesis, and there was a whole rich discussion about exploitation of kind of mathematical patterns in the physics. Obviously that's a real thing. Like obviously that's a thing that goes on, but I mean that's because, physical constraints are extremely stable and enduring. They've been around for a very, very long time. And so they've been there to work with, and organisms have both made use of them and also to some degree just not had any choice. Like not because we're hard determinists, but if there's even a skerrick of truth in the fact that these physical laws are very inflexible constraints, you have to be in conformity with them. But
Your
that's
point is those are still historically emergent, even
my
those
point.
physical laws. Yeah.
Exactly. My point is those are still historically emergent, which is a nice point that Sheldrake made. So the irony being that, Deacon was saying, oh, you used to be really Prefirmationist like Rupert Sheldrake, but now you've grown out of that. And it's like the discussion that Sheldrake and Vernon were having about laws. Sheldrake is going the full purse, the cosmological purse now. Laws are habits, laws are conventions, laws are themselves evolved and potentially evolving, but are not eternal, and therefore not unexplained explainers, right? There is a process which led to them, and in principle, there might be a way of explaining that. So that was ironic. Where was I going to? Well, yeah, the physical constraints are those kinds of things. They are habits, conventions as well, but in a different, substrate or whatever, or layer of reality, if you want to think that way. But Mike kept saying, it's just there in the mathematics. It's just there in the mathematics. And it's like, again, I don't want to. Mike is an incredibly subtle and brilliant guy, and I have a huge amount of respect for him. But it's like, where is the mathematics? Well, when you run an algorithm on a computer, this is instantiated in a concrete system that is itself making use of all the physical constraints. Are mathematics and physics the same thing? I don't think that they are. There are obviously, an unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics and physics and all that, but they're not the same thing. Um, where and to the point from right at the beginning about not having access to kind of pure potential because we are ourselves actual. So anything we have access to is adjacent to us in some sense. Like, how would we have access to any mathematics that was pure in the sense that it had no relationship with our nervous systems or no relationship with any physical substrate whatsoever? So I don't think it's not enough to say it's just there in the mathematics per se. You know,
Mhm.
a system or a pattern of relations that is describable using this mathematics, has these properties which are indeed surprising, incredible work that, Mike and Josh Bongard and others have been doing on like minimal cognitive systems and stuff. Amazing work. But I don't, we don't need, I think, to go straight to a kind of Prefirmationist, Platonist, like mathematical Platonism to try and account for that kind of thing.
Right.
I do want to talk about compression and decompression, but uh,
Yeah, well, I think when I don't remember, I guess it was Mike who said that something like there are causes that are beyond physics and history that are mathematical causes. And that runs afoul of Whitehead's ontological principle, which is, that all causes are actual entities and not his eternal objects are not the reasons that anything exists. They're
Hmm.
drawn upon by what
Yeah.
exists to characterize themselves, but that's all the agency is with the actualities. And Mike and I have been trying to hash that out, and I I continue to be surprised that an a developmental biologist is more Platonist than me on this question. But it's an interesting position to be in. But there is a way in which Whitehead, wants to say that there is something invariant presupposed even in this evolutionary ontology where we want to emphasize variation as the first. Um, and but for Whitehead, it's not anything geometrical. It's not anything. Um, it's not a law of physics,
Hmm.
right? That's um, eternal. But when he talks about the extensive continuum, which for him is sort of one way of talking about the primordial nature of God is this extensive continuum, um, which he describes as one relational complex in which all potential objectifications find their niche. Um,
Hmm.
and he says that the extensive continuum expresses the solidarity of all possible standpoints throughout the whole process of the world, but it is not a fact prior to the world. It is the
Mm.
first determination of order, that is, of real potentiality, arising out of the general character of the world. Um, and so this is how, his primordial nature of God is a fact, not an idea or a posit or an abstraction, which is, I think, what Peirce is also arguing for. Um, he's,
Yeah,
you know, um,
depending on which purse. But
but
I think,
yeah, or which Whitehead.
yeah,
Um, but I think this, and he says that in terms of what characterizes the nature of this extensive continuum, um, I want to just share a little bit more of what he says there. Yeah, it does not involve shapes, dimensions, measurability. These are all additional determinations of real potentiality that arise within our cosmic epoch, within the historical process. Um, but nonetheless, he wants to refer to the extensive continuum as a real potentiality, and he thinks we can know it in principle. He thinks that it has something to do with adjacency, which I know is a very important idea for you. Um,
yeah,
Whitehead thinks that that is not something we derive from
yeah.
historical process, but something that allows us to understand historical process. It's a principle that allows us to understand variation, an invariant principle that allows us to understand variation.
Yeah. And I think that's a point that's very well taken,
Mhm.
uh, in the sense that in order for selection to occur, there needs to be a kind of, I mean, in order for relations to exist,
Yeah.
there needs to be some kind of principle of adjacency. And so, yeah, you're gonna converge on a point where there is this, minimal set of relation of principles. Um,
Mhm.
and you know, you do perceive that, I think. I mean, this is the sense in which I think it's a kind of, inverted transcendentalism or
Mhm.
descendentalism if you want. Um, but we read off the horizon in some sense, but what is the most generic set of principles that seem to apply to everything, basically? And they're of course maximally abstract. And of course, they necessarily imply other things, like they couldn't really be absolutely deconstructible because then you wouldn't be able to generate anything from them. So they have to be and so you're picking your most impoverished scheme, if that's indeed the way you pursue speculative ontology,
Mhm.
um, in a kind of very careful way, hopefully, but also in a way, it's going to devolve on some aesthetic principle that you have, where you're like, well, I prefer to derive, adjacency from selection, or to say that those are also actually isomorphic in some sense, like adjacency and selection. So I speak of, mostly in my private notes, but adjacency selectionism, but like there's some like selectionism implies a certain kind of adjacency, and adjacency in a relational philosophy implies selection because it's a formational influence. Like by being in contact in some way with this other thing, I am, reciprocally shaped by it.
Yeah.
I think
And
there,
this bottoms out into the aporia of like
yeah,
Whitehead's co-ultimates, creativity and the primordial nature. It's like is adjacency historically emergent or necessary to understand the idea of historical emergence or the reality of it? I mean, you kind of
yeah.
just need both already.
Yeah,
Um,
well, I mean, yeah, I guess if you materialize in some sense the metaphor, and so you've got like this a Simondonian conception of a pre-individual field, um, there are it's one important point, and I just think that people are just using the words differently. Like I think if I were going to respond to just that quote you read, there's a lot of things that I'm going to nitpick there because I don't use those words in that way. Like, all potential objectifications find their niche. I'm like, not in something that's permanent, man. No, um, or eternal. because there's too much pre-definiteness in that. Whereas if we went in the Simondonian direction, and he has beautiful quotes, which I don't have all, I mean, I may have them accessible, but um, about the pre-individual, like if it's kind of if reluctantly we were going to think a cosmogen, he doesn't say it in this way, but he basically says you might accuse me if I extend this kind of argument into a cosmic register. He doesn't say cosmic, of a kind of creationist principle. But okay, here's a quote then. The prime mover would not be simple and singular, but the being insofar as it is anterior to any appearance of phases, harboring them energetically, yet not as forms or structures that can come forth. In the same way as the position of the problem in a certain sense bears the possible solution as a tension toward a signification that incorporates the data of the problem, albeit without the prior formation of the effective lines of the solution, which would only appear through the real becoming of the resolutive invention, and which are this becoming. Thus, the capacity of resolutive becoming is contained in the being before any becoming through the incompatibility that it will be able to make compatible, but not the line of this becoming's existence, which is not already given and cannot be preformed since the problematic is without phases. That will probably be even harder for most people to pass than the Whitehead quote. Probably consider it's less poetic for sure. But all of these things like without phases, the line of this becoming's existence is not already given. Without the prior formation of the effective lines of the solution, not as forms or structures that can come forth. He is obviously speaking at the limit of thought. So you'd be able to nitpick. We would all be able to nitpick. This is a verbal expression of that which cannot be spoken in some sense, right? You're talking
The
about the
only
inner.
obvious thing you could say about that statement is he's speaking at the limits of thought.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. But those little provisos that he constantly has, and he is trying to figure this from, a schema that he has derived from an exhaustive study of the science of his time. Like the detail, I mean, it's like mind-numbing at points, the detail that Simondon goes into in his investigation of different scientific paradigms. Um, but the little qualifications that he has, even though the Whitehead sounds more beautiful, I would agree. Even though I do think Simondon can sometimes write some really beautiful passages too. But these things, not as forms or structures that can come forth without prior format, all of that stuff to me is hedging a little bit more safely in a way than some of the things that Whitehead, some of the language that Whitehead wants to use. Um, so I guess that's all, perhaps all there
Yeah.
is to say there. But
Yeah.
some of this relates to this compression decompression thing. I don't. We've been going for ages, but I don't know if we want to quickly talk about that. And to the basic idea here, and maybe you can, because you made better notes on the discussion than I did, but I didn't make any. But the basic idea here would be that let's say genetics is a form of compression. It's compressing that set of traits, strategies, whatever that worked during the life of an organism. It is a compression of them, so that was selected for basically. It is a compression of them into a heritable form that is then passed to the next generation, and then the ontogenesis of the next individual is a decompression of that compressed information. And it works pretty well as a metaphor. And actually, Mike's done some really beautiful stuff that I really like on bow tie nodes. And actually, the improvisation is very Ruyerian in this case. The improvisation that goes on during this decompression process. And of course, there's improvisation because the inheritance is lossy, right? Like there are degrees of freedom, and that's why there's developmental plasticity, phenotypic plasticity, experience-dependent plasticity. Why you have a one-to-many relationship here, in the sense that one genome can make many different individuals, and in fact, according to a generic principle of individuation, will be continuing to make a new individual every time something happens. Um, so that's nice. I guess that some of the points that I would make is, um, to the extent that the genome contains compressed information and therefore is a constraint function, it's actually itself a form of selection. It's the product of selection, but it acts as a selector, which is its informative role. It's in some sense, it's got a very narrow role in that it is it does other things too, but the main thing it's constraining is like transcription, the formation of mRNA transcripts, or basically you could say skipping over transcription, translation, and that is a two-part process. It's constraining ribosomes. It also encodes ribosomes, but it constrains them and tells them what proteins to make. So a ribosome can make like, an indefinite array of different protein forms. Um, but the genome is telling it which ones to make. So it's a selection function on the behavior of the ribosome. But there's all kinds of stuff that therefore downstream or whatever of that production of proteins, it just can't constrain, doesn't constrain.
I mean, the
Um,
amino acid sequence is not exhaustively constraining what the function of the protein is. I mean,
No, not at all. And yeah, and in even way less than probably most people, probably even a lot of biologists imagine, in the sense that I mentioned earlier that proteins are not really stereospecific in their interactions, in the sense that they interact with a lot of different things. And they interact, and their structure is about biasing those kinds of interaction propensities and the effects of those interactions. So it's a constraint on that, but it's not a one-to-one kind of constraint. Things are accidentally doing, stuff that they haven't been selected for all the time. And that is actually the grist for the mill of molecular exaptation. It's really important that they do other things, that they're not fully constrained, but they even change shape. When they bind one thing, they change conformation, and that changes their functional their propensity to bind other things. Like the proteins are like, very dynamic entities themselves, right? So there's all this, I guess, and we've already made this point. There are all of these other layers of kind of unconstrained degrees of freedom beyond beyond the template for the production of a bunch of particular, protein forms, and that includes the degrees of freedom of the proteins
right,
themselves.
right. And I guess this is what Deacon means by the difference between information and interpretation. Like if we say that there's some information in the genome, in the nucleic acid sequence, and in the amino acid sequence that gets translated into, um, that's not the way necessarily that meaning gets produced by the ways that uh, proteins end up, um, I would say, exerting agency in their intracellular environment.
Well,
Um,
yeah, I would speak in this case to differentiate from chemical ecology, although this term molecular ecology is already a kind of overdetermined term as well. But I would speak of an ecology of molecules, right? That the meaning of a molecule, or the like function or capacity that it has, in fact, not only its function but also its properties, and all properties are this way, but like are radically context dependent. So it's like where is this protein in the body of the organism, and what is its ecosystem in terms of interaction partners, and what are their relative abundances, because a lot of effects are like stoichiometric and things. They rely on relative amounts of interactions. It's not like one protein and another, one protein interaction has this big effect on the phenotype. It's population level, hence it's probabilistic. It's, biased and canalized and things, but it's not,
and proteins aren't just interacting with environmental conditions and then other proteins, but they're feeding back on the genome itself and activating other genomes that maybe had remained dormant until the environmental trigger cued it to start.
So they're regulating gene expression in this sense, and that's a major source of plasticity, cell differentiation. It's like crazy amount of shit going on, right?
But when I ask what's more concrete, ontogeny or phylogeny, I think I'm trying to emphasize what Deacon was trying to say about how he thinks biology has underemphasized the decompression process,
Yep.
and overemphasized the compression process, genetics, in other words. And
Neo-Darwinian biology has gone in that direction, definitely.
Right.
I hate that term, as you know, neo-Darwinian. It's just so stupid because it's like anti-Darwinian. But I mean, obviously, it has Darwinian aspects to it, right? And we can all quibble over what's the like key aspects of Darwin's thought. But if you take Darwin's real intervention, whatever, like particular intervention to be against the doctrine of special creationism, special creation, so
Of
it's an
species.
anti of species. Yeah, exactly. Good rejoinder. But that's what I mean by special creation as opposed to creationism, I suppose, right?
Right.
Like, which is just the Aristotelian notion of there being a species essence, and then the fact that every individual is different is because of accidental variation, or actually in Platonic terms, it's because of choric necessity, because matter cannot take the form perfectly because it's too unwieldy. Um, but that puts the form before the accident, so to speak, right? And says all the variation is a deviation from the essential form. And Darwin just switches that. No, species, the patterns of variation, the clumping, which enable us to speak about species and genera and be able to do our classifications and all of that kind of stuff. And these are, again, real concrete abstractions. They're not fake. It's not that species are not a thing, but they emerge from and also thus blur at their boundaries. So they're not natural kinds, because natural kinds are the result of special creation events. They emerge from this variational process. So if you take that to be the Darwinian view, which is the anti-hylomorphic view, then the neo-Darwinian view is anti-Darwinian in the sense that it goes back to this hylomorphic view where, yes, they do have a notion of random, which is basically an accident, but it's very much trapped in this germ, in the germ content, in the compressed content, and it is the determining factor. And even though individuals might vary, so even though there's a kind of phenotypic plasticity, that's irrelevant to evolution, which is again the opposite of the Darwinian logic, because this variation of individuals, that all characters can vary to some degree, right? And he says stuff like that is, in fact, that's the variation that's grist for the mill of selection. Because he's not wedded to a particular mechanism of inheritance, he can make general claims which turn out to actually be more true. So when they got like really jazzed on precision and reductionism, and trying to be like physics, and that has led us astray. That has led us to the overemphasis on compression in this terminology. So yeah. And the other thing, I guess I already said it before about compression, is that heaps of the variation, though, that an organism will accumulate cannot be compressed back into the genome. But that's why there are all these other layers of compression,
Mhm.
including the epigenetic mechanisms, but everything up to and including, cultural norms and language and all these
And
things.
everything down to, these laws or emergent habits of physics that provide for the phi spiral and geometric packing and all these other.
Although that's not why those exist. Those pre-exist that lossiness of compression. But yeah, for sure,
Yeah.
they are a form of compression, absolutely, and they can be exploited. Yeah,
Right. As
they're
fluids.
there's a lot you don't need to compress because it's what you can take for granted about the environment in which
Yeah.
decompression is going to take place because
Yeah.
it's invariant at the time scale that is relative. And again, you can see that at different time scales. That's specialization. So you can say like all organisms are specialized for these physical constraints,
Yeah.
whereas some organisms are specialized for very, very specific niches. And so they put a lot of stock, their compression process or whatever puts a lot of stock in a certain stability of the environment, which is great for them as long as that stability exists. But when it goes away, specialists can be very vulnerable to extinction because they're not adaptable. And so
Yeah.
that's why we have different uh, generalist and specialist things. But so yeah, I mean, culture, etc., Korzybski time binding, those are also forms of compression that are relevant here. Oh, and just to go back to the genome as constraint or information, it's important, we must always remember that there's also cellular inheritance. So
Right.
even at the level of this, phylogenetic multiple generation conception of evolution, um, there are a certain set of constraints that can also be taken for granted by the gene, which are not encoded in the genome, which are like the constraints associated with the cellular cytoskeleton and things like that, or the pre-existence of a ribosome. You know, things that are inherited directly somatically from the prior generation, which are necessary to begin that decompression process and ensure that it is, you know, dually canalized from the very beginning. The genes themselves are canalizing constraint functions. That's the sense in which they are information, but also the cell structure and the cellular machinery, if we don't mind that metaphor for a moment, that, you know, that
Triggered. No, I'm just kidding.
can be taken for granted
Yeah.
is kind of always already going to be there too.
So two things, and then I think we need to wrap up. Um, so Darwin does reject special creation of species, but I think he's still, because he has a mechanistic physics in the background, assuming special creation of life. Maybe I mean he uses the rhetoric of the divine breathing life into the first or a few forms of life.
Yeah,
Maybe that's just poetic gloss, but
I
still
think so.
there's a kind of mystery there that he's assuming.
Yeah.
Um,
Life is a given. Life is a given to him. He's not. He does, as you know, as we know, he has his warm, wet pool and blah blah blah. But he's that's not really the level at which his explanatory intervention is made.
and then the Goethean point would be about the human, which doesn't seem to be explainable in terms of specialization. The human seems to be profoundly unspecial, more general. And I is this in the sense that we've the neoteny and the way in which we've avoided becoming overly fixed into a niche, and you know we don't have claws, fangs, and you know we're not especially powerful as most predators are, and yet because of our capacity to survive in multiple environments and to be especially malleable, um, we're dominant on the planet right now. And so there seems to be something strange happening with the human being in terms of not fitting into a niche. I think that would be Goethe's suggestion. But even I'm wondering, because it's been a while since I've read Descent of Man, doesn't Goethe make a similar point about humans being,
Darwin.
Darwin say something about us being unspecialized in a weird way?
Yeah. I also need to reread Descent of Man, but yes, he does. And I think it's a generic point. Like I think a lot of people make that point.
Yeah.
Um, but I think, you know, so I often say, and I will have said many times in our recorded conversations, you know, humans are the species whose niche is niche construction. So one of the
Yeah.
things
We're
it's
the
not
most artificial species, in other words.
yeah. So it's not in a sense that we're not specialized, you know, that we don't have a relatively narrow set of, you know, parameters within which we do well. It's that we're very good at creating those or sheltering ourselves. So we're good at self-selecting,
Mhm.
self-canalizing, because this is what niche construction is. You know, niche construction is another form of compression. So it's another way of so there's inheritance, obviously, of you know, along that line as well, but it's a way of canalizing ontogenesis or decompression in this sense, by putting a set of canalizing operators into our environment. And you know, one of the really nice things that Terence also said was that when he talked about memory and he talked about, you know, synaptic weighting and various things as ways of biasing a kind of a metabolic flux that was going to pass through that you know, neuronal network. And what would be recovered, the decompression in this sense, would be the canalizing of that flux by what had been stabilized as relatively invariant on that time scale. And again,
Mhm.
that's kind of it's just like, I don't think I said that very eloquently, but that's very similar to niche construction, that you are creating something relatively invariant that is going to keep canalizing the more rapidly changing dynamics of the system. And so a lot of this is like that. Like a lot of this is about separating change like rates of change over different time scales, and that applies to everything from the kind of physical constraints which an organism can take for granted, through the genetic, like through all these different modes of inheritance, and even this kind of moment to moment
Mm.
ontogenesis thing.
Yeah,
There's a separation of timescales going on where the thing that's moving really, really fast through the system can be canalized by the thing that is changing less rapidly. And that's like a
yep,
long-term equation or something. So that,
sure. But I think also, I don't want to false binary because I agree, we should be thinking in terms of ontophylogenesis, but um, phylogeny, the history of life generationally, is a series of uh, individual organisms,
yeah,
and the creativity, the decision making, the learning, all of the stuff that individual organisms do in their ontogenesis and their development might not be um, might not be compressed as information contained in the genome, but it's nonetheless inherited in the broader context of um, memory.
yeah.
And,
Well, because of multimodal inheritance, as we're talking about, yeah,
right.
the
And so
genome is,
what's more concrete? Like we're
yeah,
always
yeah,
individual, the present moment where all the causal activity is happening is individual organisms. And
yeah. And
so
I
rather
think
than
that,
thinking of the genome or phylogeny as being the main causal factor, I do really appreciate Deacon's point that we need to pay more attention to the decompression, the development, the individual organism and its process of ontogeny when we want to understand life, you know.
yes, I 100% agree. And I think that that is, you know, very much echoed in the so-called organismal turn in biology, which I just think is also just a turn back to, Darwin and common sense. Um, but I just see phylogeny, if we're restricting that term, I mean, the genesis of trees, tree, we can get all Deleuze-Guattari in here and, contrast trees and rhizomes, but like ecological or synchronic relationships are very rhizomatic because they're horizontal and they are like very, very complicated and always changing and blah, blah, blah. And what we get over vast periods of evolutionary time, when we understand diachronic relations in this, we can say relatively abstract way, again, there's abstraction going on at all these levels, is this tree form. And part of what's going on there is that compression process where not all of the details of ecology of synchronic relations are compressed into genomes. And indeed, when we have the trees, they look relatively tree-like, even though trees are in fact wildly fractal. And an actual tree, if you get really, really close to it and look at all of its, twigs and everything,
It's more rhizomatic than, yeah.
is more rhizomatic at different levels, right? It's just zoom in, zoom out. If you abstract and look at a very long period of history, you also have the selection biases that result from the loss of records of many elements of the past. In fact, many lineages, not only actual synchronic relations that were going on at a very specific time, but lineages that existed either are lost forever or we haven't recovered them yet, or we just haven't sequenced them yet. Like how minimal our like sequencing is still in some even in this incredible age of big data. Like when we're doing reconstructing evolutionary histories of Hymenopteron, bee, ant, and wasp, venom evolution, and we are using a comparative genomic method now, and it's this incredible stuff, and we're working with so much data, but we're working with like 100 genomes out of like, I mean, minimally 100,000 species, maybe over a million. It's like the amount. So there are selection biases at all these levels, and then when we develop a visual representation of that very biased landscape for all these reasons, again, it looks tree-like. If you zoomed in, it would look rhizomatic.
Mm.
So I don't know, like phylogeny. There's an overemphasis on a particular mode of inheritance, I would say, and
Sure.
because that mode of inheritance has been dominant, and we even get, ridiculous things like genetic determinism and stuff, there has been too much of a focus on compression. And I would say, and so I completely agree if you're framing it that way, but I would even say there's too much of a focus on one mode of compression,
Mm.
uh, rather than all these other forms of inheritance, which are equally can be described as forms of compression. So yeah, I mean, I agree with what you're saying. It becomes very abstract, the focus on phylogeny, if we define phylogeny according to all of these abstractions. If we're just thinking about lineages, that could be cellular lineages. That could be the individual as a lineage.
Mm.
So I think when you're thinking in terms of the bare principles, they are just the same thing to me on different timescales, and that's partly because I don't recognize the privilege, again, even though I work a lot in molecular biology, of genetic inheritance over other forms of inheritance. So
Mm.
there are organisms that don't rely on that nearly as much, like Mike's planaria, for example, but organisms that undergo all kinds of somatic changes and reproduce by fission more than they do. And of course, sexual
Yeah.
reproduction is a very particular thing.
I
Uh,
think you and I both want to avoid determinism, and the way that I would emphasize for doing so to avoid that is to say that the past is always present as a potential. It's never present um, as a determination of what happens in the present. It's present as a potential that what the organism, um, what creativity is doing in the present is always going to involve some degree of inheritance, but always inheritance um, uh, of potentialities, inheritance of kind of food that needs to be digested and reproduced in the present, right? So there's never a way in which the past could force what's occurring in the present.
yeah, yeah, no, for sure. I mean, the past is an enabling constraint. Obviously, for evolutionary thinkers, we have this constructive, way of thinking, right? The universe doesn't like renew itself. It's not a Boltzmann brain, right?
Mm.
It has a history which is not deterministic but determining in some sense. And the way that works for me is exactly in terms of this principle of the virtual or the potential is only structured by these principles of adjacency, which are the past. So like an actual situation comes along with this structuration of a virtuality because of what it is inheriting from its past, like it's inheriting that structured relationship to virtuality from the past. So all of this constructed complexity that we have that is associated with all of these degrees of freedom that we might have, that is, of course, the bequest of the lineage, and not to be overly phylogenetic about it, but is the bequest of history. I just think that's really different from saying that the history is like wholly present. I don't this is I've said this to you in private. I just don't see the need for the rushing to the limit. Like we don't need to say whole, we don't need to say entire. And
Yeah,
Berg's
well, yeah.
examples are very unconvincing.
Mm.
Like his actual examples, like the way that a memory might, suddenly jump out at us and be very high fidelity and kind of erupt from the unconscious. And this gives us an example, like a demonstration, a phenomenological experience yeah, it shows that there are a
Mm.
lot of things that you're not remembering most of the time that haven't in fact been lost. It doesn't show you that the whole of the past has been lost.
Yeah.
The past, though, does work, and those eruptive memories do work exactly in the sense that we were talking about information working. They work as a fascinating constraint that elicits some novel arrangement from you. They are individuating
Yeah.
potential.
Or dormant genes that have to be activated by environmental cues that
Yeah, exactly.
um,
Exactly. So there's tons that we don't normally that is not normally present for us that may yet be, that still has that potential. And this thing about the structuring of virtuality is exactly the discussion we've been having for the last, hour and a half or whatever about compression. Not we haven't been talking about compression exactly, but all of these different modes of inheritance, memory, are structurations of virtuality. They are canalizations of, again, if we think about it in very concrete terms, all that stochastic behavior that's going on in an organism at all these different levels, spontaneous, stochastic, undirected, intrinsically undirected behavior, is canalized by all of these compressions, whether that's, again, the genes, whether that's something in niche construction, whether that's the language that a child is interpolated into or acquires, whether that's like the way you set up your environment. And mine's pretty chaotic, so maybe some more canalization could be going on. But the things that you set up, the habits that you develop to keep yourself on the rails, that's a way of structuring your potential, because you could fly off in all sorts of different directions, but you leave the Simondon book on top of your computer at night so that you remember that the plan tomorrow is not to look at the 1,000 other books in your room, but actually to read some more bloody Simondon. Like ways we seed a future,
Right.
canalization of our behavior.
Mhm.
Yeah, and they're all again at some very abstract level. Those things are all the same. There are very important differences. Different modes and mechanisms of compression can do very different things and work on different timescales and all of that. But in
Yeah.
some sense, in the speculative ontological impoverishment diagrammatic sense, there's something very, very much shared in common.
Yeah. I'm running up against a couple of metabolic constraints, which is
Yeah.
that I have to urinate. Philo is threatening to claw me in the back if I don't feed
I noticed in there. Sorry for. I always have to apologize.
him. I should
And
have fed him before we sat down. I just
no,
I forgot, and he's patient right now because he realizes that
I
his
think
attempts to scratch me are not working yet.
I'm the same. I need to pee. I need to eat. I've not really had breakfast, and it's like 12:30 now. I
Been
hope
pretty good for no breakfast.
I hope like one or two listeners make it this far, because it's two different conversations in some sense, and I think that the Deacon Levin reflections were pretty rich. I hope anyway. I think there was a lot of good stuff there. So
Yeah. Yeah. Always too much uh, to untangle, but enjoyed this one. And
yeah,
I mentioned the stuff about the human and specialization versus being unspecialized because I think it would be fun to talk about Christoph Hewick's book and his engagement with Darwin. Um,
yeah,
so I don't know if that's where we go next, but I wanted to.
definitely can. I mean, we also talked about the Simondon Novalis
Oh,
paper.
right. Yeah, yeah. Romantic mechanism or whatever that paper is called.
Def- Definitely. Why don't we do the Simon de Novalis, just because it's short? But why
Mhm.
don't you also prepare for me like a list of excerpts from the Hewick that you think I should read so that we can angle towards that too?
Perfect. That sounds fun. Cool.
Awesome.
All right, Tim. Enjoy the rest of your day.
You too,
And
man.
until next time.
Yeah, mate.
Take care.